Hey everyone, this is a piece by Helmut Reichelt titled Marx's Critique of Economic Categories, Reflections on the Problem of Validity in the Dialectical Method of Presentation in Capital. I'm going to read the abstract real quick. It has often been pointed out that the Marxian theory of value contains some inconsistencies, usually in relation to the concept of abstract labor. However, the contradiction between the concept of labor and the concept of validity with which Marx operates in Capital, without actually explaining this conception, has never been discussed. A detailed analysis shows that this concept of validity refers to the process of abstraction, which is carried out by the participants of the exchange process. Only the rigorous comprehension of this process of abstraction can illuminate that for which the concept of abstract labor was developed, the unity and universality of value. On this basis, the paper criticizes the Marxian development of the money form and presents an alternative approach that builds on the aforementioned concept of validity. This concept is formulated in more depth by recourse to the works of Hegel, Simmel, and Adorno. Furthermore, the paper reconsiders the dialectical development of categories in the light of this alternative conception of the money form as totality and abstraction, in the sense of Hegel and the young Marx. Finally, the distinction between simple circulation and the process as a whole, found only in the Grundrisse, is explored, and it is argued that, according to the novel reading proposed, it acquires a fundamental significance. I might actually release all these as individual pieces. That may be annoying, but I think it, I don't know. No, I'm not going to do that. Fuck that. Critical theory as a program for a new reading of Marx. Footnote. This article first appeared in Fetcher and Schmidt's edited volume 2001. Translation is by Werner Strauss, editing by Jim Kincaid. I don't think I have anything from Alfred Schmidt on this channel, but I definitely have Irving Fetcher's book, Marx and Marxism. Anyway, end footnote. The, quote, principle of exchange, end quote, and connected to this, the, quote, exchange abstraction, end quote, as, quote, real abstraction, form a central component of Adorno's concept of society. Quote, one could, end quote, Jürgen Reichelt argues, quote, almost describe the principle of exchange as the central theme of Adorno's critical theory, end quote. Sorry. According to German Wikipedia, Jürgen Reichelt, born July 1935, is a German sociologist. After graduating from high school, Jürgen Reichelt completed a commercial apprenticeship from 1956 to 1958. He then studied sociology at the Johann Wolfgang Goethe University in Frankfurt am Main. He graduated with a degree in sociology in 1963. From 1963 to 1966, he worked as an assistant to Ludwig von Friedeberg at the Free University of Berlin. Jürgen Reichelt received his doctorate there in 1966 with his dissertation on action theory and the antinomy of freedom. From 1966 onwards, Reichelt worked as an academic counselor in Frankfurt. From 1971 until his retirement in 2000, he taught as a professor of sociology at the University of Frankfurt am Main. Jürgen Reichert's research focuses on social philosophy, social theory, the logic of the social sciences, and the methods of the social sciences. Back to the text. It is true that the expression, quote, real abstraction, used for the first time by Georg Simmel, is nowhere to be found in Adorno, but in essence the issue is the same. Footnote. See Simmel, 1978, quote, it is not as strange as it may seem at first glance that not only the study of the economy, but the economy itself is constituted by a real abstraction from the comprehensive reality of values, end quote. Simmel, end footnote. Adorno talks about a, quote, objective abstraction, end quote, in the process of exchange itself, which is, quote, the same as the objectivity of the conceptual moment, irrespective of whether people reflect on this or not, end quote. Adorno. Footnote, taken from notes by Hans-Georg Bachhaus on an Adorno seminar in the semester of 1962. See the appendix to Bachhaus, 1997. End footnote. A distinction is therefore expressly made between the reality of this abstraction, which is objectively conceptual, and the conceptuality of the subjects themselves who carry out this process. Quote, the person who attributes the conceptual to social reality need not fear the accusation of being idealistic. What is implied here is not merely the constitutive conceptuality of the knowing subject, but also a conceptuality which holds sway in reality, Sache itself. End quote. Adorno. That Adorno is not convinced by Alfred Sohn Reichelt's solution to this problem can be indirectly seen from the notes that Adorno made after a discussion with Sohn Reichelt. Footnote. This contrasts with his earlier euphoric comments in a letter dated the 17th of November, 1936. Quote, Dear Alfred, I don't think I'm exaggerating if I tell you that your letter was responsible for the greatest intellectual shock I have experienced in philosophy since I first encountered Benjamin's work. And that was in 1923. This shock reflects the magnitude and power of your idea, but also the depth of an agreement which goes immeasurably further than you could have suspected or even I myself could have foreseen, end quote. Adorno and Sohn Reichelt, 1991, page 32. My thanks to Hans Joachim Blank for this reference. That quote was from Adorno. End footnote. End footnote. It can, however, also be seen that Adorno ascribed programmatic status to his own formulations. Quote, what is required is a systematic, comprehensive analysis of the exchange abstraction, end quote, was Adorno's concluding summary. Adorno himself did not provide such an analysis, and surely not just because of lack of time. Reichelt is right to say, quote, economics was ... not his, Adorno's, concern, end quote. In private conversation, Adorno made no secret of his aversion to dealing with the economy. All the more astonishing, then, are Adorno's sometimes brilliantly intuitive insights into the nature of the capitalist economy. Although Adorno repeatedly spoke about the exchange society, Adorno should not be described, as Adorno so often wrongly is, as a theorist of an exchange society in the economic sense. The essence of Adorno's critical theory lies in the very fact that Adorno understands the capitalist economy as an inverted reality in which individuals no longer, quote, interact with one another, end quote, on the market as rationally acting subjects, as the idea of the exchange economy suggests. Adorno criticized such a concept as, quote, social nominalism, end quote. Rather, they act as executors of constraints generated and reproduced by themselves, which are implemented in and through their conscious actions without, however, these being consciously accessible to them. That is what the strong concept of totality means, which should not be confused with the mechanistic idea in which, quote, everything is linked with everything else, end quote, parenthesis, Albert, end parenthesis, or with the hermeneutic one that operates by, quote, anticipating the interpretation of a connection of meaning, end quote, Habermas. Totality is not a methodological postulate, but rather the concept of a real, quote, becoming autonomous, bracket, Verselbständigung, end bracket, end quote. Quote, totality, is pre-established for all individual subjects since they obey its, quote, constraints, end quote, even in themselves and even in their monadological constitution, and here in particular, conceptualized totality. To this extent, totality is what is most real, end quote. Adorno. Adorno is therefore vehemently against any leveling down of society to an intelligible coherence. Adorno insists that society is both, quote, intelligible and unintelligible, end quote. Adorno. Hermeneutics, however, must not merely be, quote, supplemented, end quote, by dialectics. Rather, the unintelligible becomes primary, and hermeneutics is the method which is directed towards dimensions of meaning that have been structured by the very dynamics of an inversion process. Quote, yet the objective rationality of society, namely that of exchange, continues to distance itself through its dynamics from the model of logical reason. Consequently, society, become autonomous, is in turn no longer intelligible. Only the law of society's autonomization is intelligible, end quote, Adorno. This law of autonomization reconstructs a movement executed by means of the conscious action of individuals, but which at the same time eludes conscious understanding, quote, they do not know it, but they do it, end quote, in Marx's concise formulation. Therefore, the constitutive moment of unconsciousness, which determines the social reproduction process, is the actual object of dialectical criticism. Staying close to Hegel's crucial dictum that reality, bracket, Sache, end bracket, and method are not to be separated, Adorno too postulates that dialectics, when dialectics wishes to conceptualize the object, quote, as possessing motion in itself, end quote, does not have at its disposal, quote, a method independent of the object, end quote, but has to, quote, follow the structure of the object, end quote. Adorno. What kind of object becomes autonomous, inverts that object's self, takes over the primary position, although that object itself is a creation, spreads to become a systemic Moloch, and reduces the living individuals who, after all, create that object in their own, quote, life world, Lebenswelt, end quote, to mere appendages. Malach, or Molech, or Molech, is a word which appears in the Hebrew Bible several times, primarily in the book of Leviticus. The Bible strongly condemns practices that are associated with Malach, which are heavily implied to include child sacrifice. Traditionally, the name Malach has been understood as referring to a Canaanite god, or Canaanite god. However, since 1935, scholars have speculated that Malach refers to the sacrifice itself, since the Hebrew word mich is identical in spelling to a term that means, quote, sacrifice, end quote, in the closely related Punic language. This second position has grown increasingly popular, but it remains contested. Among proponents of this second position, controversy continues as to whether the sacrifices were offered to Yahweh or another deity, and whether they were a native Israelite religious custom or a Phoenician import. Since the medieval period, Moloch has often been portrayed as a bull-headed idol with outstretched hands over a fire. This depiction takes the brief mentions of Moloch in the Bible and combines them with various sources, including ancient accounts of Carthaginian child sacrifice and the legend of the Minotaur. Beginning in the modern era, Moloch has been figuratively used in reference to a power which demands a dire sacrifice. A god Moloch appears in various works of literature and film, such as John Milton's Paradise Lost, 1667, Gustave Flaubert's Salammbô, 1862, Fritz Lang's Metropolis, 1927, and Allen Ginsberg's Howl, 1955. Back to the text, Adorno refers to Marx's critique of economics, which traces this process. Quote, in a grand manner, the unity of the critique of scientific and meta-scientific sense is revealed in the work of Marx. It is called the Critique of Political Economy, since it attempts to derive the whole that is to be criticized in terms of its right to existence from exchange, commodity form, and commodity form's imminent, quote, logical, end quote, contradictory nature. The assertion of the equivalence of what is exchanged, the basis of all exchange, is repudiated by its consequences, as the principle of exchange, by virtue of the principle of exchange's immanent dynamics, extends to the living labors of human beings. It changes compulsively into objective inequality, namely that of social classes. Forcibly stated, the contradiction is that exchange takes place justly and unjustly. End quote. Adorno. Adorno therefore assumes that the whole economy is to be developed out of a principle, the exchange principle, although this is not inherently coherent. This is not an inherently coherent, purely theoretical construct. As a presentation of the totality, the theory is also a method which, quote, follows the object, end quote, and thereby reconstructs the irrational systematicity of the real system itself. How this process of autonomization is to be conceptualized in detail is not explained by Adorno. The central concepts, objective abstraction, inversion, autonomization, totality, power of the universal over the particular, remain postulates with regard to their concretization as far as the critique of economics is concerned. Associated with this program is an outrageous claim. The whole of the critical theory depends on the convincing explication of this, quote, objective abstraction, end quote. If it is impossible to concretize this, quote, objective concept, end quote, all other concepts of the critical theory which are to be derived from this, quote, conceptuality which holds sway in reality, bracket, Sache, and bracket, itself, end quote, are exposed to the accusation of social theoretical speculation. Whether Adorno's conjecture that, quote, Marx, the dialectician, did not claim to possess a completely developed notion of dialectics. He imagined that he was simply, quote, flirting, end quote, with it, end quote, is actually correct, is difficult to decide. What is certain, however, is that Marx did not make it easy for his readers. If we consider only what Marx explicitly said about his dialectical method, we have to agree with Adorno's thesis. Footnote. For example, in the afterword to the second edition of the first volume of Capital, quote, my dialectic method is, in its foundations, not only different from the Hegelian, but directly opposite to the Hegelian. For Hegel, the process of thinking, which Hegel even transforms into an independent subject, under the name of the, quote, idea, end quote, is the creator of the real world, and the real world is only the external phenomenal form of the, quote, idea, end quote. With me, the reverse is true. The ideal is nothing else than the material world, reflected in the mind of man, and translated into forms of thought, end quote. Marx. End footnote. We have to agree, end footnote. Adorno, however, was not aware that Marx wrote to Engels on the 9th of December 1861, while working on a version of the text which was to become Capital Volume 1, that, quote, the thing is assuming a much more popular form, and the method is much less in evidence than in Part 1, end quote. Marx. Footnote. By Part 1, Marx means a contribution to the critique of political economy, which he had published in 1859. End footnote. Marx therefore evidently had a clear awareness of his method, even if he implies that he concealed this method for whatever reason. New section. Where should economic science begin? It seems therefore relatively easy to elaborate Adorno's programmatic statements for economic theory. We should turn to the works in which Marx's method is still explicit, those in which Marx's method was developed and tested, the Grundrisse as the first draft of Capital, or the Urtext, the original draft of a contribution to the critique of political economy? ? Had it been as easy as this, Marx's method would have been deciphered long ago. Still, of inestimable value is the fact that Marx took Hegel's philosophy as a starting point. Footnote, quote, what was of great use to me as regards method of treatment was Hegel's logic, at which I had taken another look by mere accident. Freiligrath having found and made me a present of several volumes of Hegel, originally the property of Bakunin, end quote. Marx, letter to Engels, 16th of January, 1858, end footnote. The choice of words is in almost every sentence in the Grundrisse reminds us of this. However, even a thorough knowledge of Hegel is not proved completely helpful, as became clear from the fleeting interventions of Hegel scholars in economics during the 1960s and early 1970s. The method is therefore not evident in the Grundrisse either. Its reconstruction remains as before to be achieved. The fact that the Grundrisse does not address the question of, quote, exchange abstraction, end quote, at all poses another problem. Although Marx characterizes his scientific work as a, quote, critique of economic categories, or, if you like, a critical expose of the system of the bourgeois economy, end quote, the Grundrisse neither offers a more detailed explanation of what is meant by economic categories, nor are these discussed in connection with the, quote, exchange abstraction, end quote. Footnote says that quote in that sentence was from a letter to LaSalle on the 22nd of February, 1858. It is only in Capital, Marx's Capital, that we find explicit references to what is to be understood by categories and to the fact that these must be developed in connection with value as an abstraction carried out by those performing the exchange themselves. Here, categories are defined in all the clarity that could be wished for as, quote, objective forms of thought, end quote, and characterized as being, quote, subjective objective, end quote. And value is characterized as a product of abstraction, which, quote, exists in the head, end quote. Quote, here, quote, equivalent, end quote, only means similarity of magnitude, after both objects have first been reduced tacitly in our head to the abstraction of value, end quote. Marx. However, these are no more than hints and in turn raise another problem. Given this determination of value as a mental abstraction, the question is how the connection between labor and value is to be conceived. In Capital, Marx repeats his criticism of Feuerbach in relation to economics. In 1845, Marx characterized Feuerbach's thinking as a half-truth and stated that the detachment of the secular basis from itself, namely the duplication, had likewise to be theoretically substantiated. Footnote. See his fourth thesis on Feuerbach. Quote, Feuerbach starts out from the fact of religious self-alienation, of the duplication of the world into a religious world and a secular world. Feuerbach's work consists in resolving the religious world into the religious world's secular basis. But the secular basis detaches itself from itself and establishes itself as an independent realm in the clouds can only be explained by the cleavages and self-contradictions within this secular base, end quote. End footnote. In Capital, Marx wrote, quote, political economy has indeed analyzed, however incompletely, value and value's magnitude, and has discovered what lies beneath these forms. But it has never once asked the question why labor is represented by the value of labor's product and labor time by the magnitude of that value, end quote, Marx, Capital. But how does this abstract human labor, which is determined as, quote, expenditure of human brain, nerves, muscles, etc., end quote, become transformed into the abstractness of value? How can this expenditure, quote, assume the form of value, end quote? While it is already difficult to comprehend this determination of abstract labor, a highly controversial topic of discussion among Marxist scholars, the connection between value abstraction and labor as the substance of value is virtually incomprehensible. My argument runs as follows. The Grundrisse is based on a different conception of presentation from that of Marx's published version of his critique of political economy. In the latter, Marx starts from the assumption of a fully developed capitalism. Thus in Capital, although Marx starts by dealing with commodities, these are already the products of capitalist production, that is, quote, the embodiment of abstract labor, end quote. In the Grundrisse, however, he distinguishes between 1, quote, exchange value positing, buying and selling, end quote, or Tauschwertsende, Tauschwertsende, buying and selling, end quote. Assuming, but fuck the whole up. 1, quote, exchange value positing, Tauschwertsende, buying and selling, end quote, and 2, quote, exchange value positing labor, end quote. The former is also described as, quote, simple circulation, end quote, an expression which is already hardly used in a contribution and which is not found in capital at all. The concept of exchange value positing labor can be read as an earlier determination of the twofold character of labor, an expression which is also used more frequently in a contribution. Exchange value positing labor is also characterized as, quote, the abstraction of the category, quote, labor as such, end quote, labor pure and simple, bracket, which, end bracket, becomes true in practice, end quote. Although the counterterm is not expressly described as, quote, the theoretical truth, end quote, of abstract labor. However, in the way of presenting the argument which structures the Grundrisse, abstract labor is treated as, quote, labor as such, end quote, as a category which, quote, still lies more in our subjective reflection, end quote. Marx. When Marx moves to the different concept of presentation which structures capital, there is a change in the way value is initially introduced. In capital, Marx has to presuppose that value is something which is already produced by capital. And this considerably affects Marx's account of the initial determination of value. Marx begins and must begin with real value as produced, and from there he has to determine the twofold character of labor. Marx finds it impossible to integrate this latter conception of value with value as a product of abstraction affected by those carrying out the exchange, also dealt with in the first chapter of Capital. As we will see, Marx tried to do this in the first edition of Capital. In the Grundrisse, however, he had begun with value as is, quote, developed, end quote, through simple circulation. Value is consequently not conceived in relation to labor. Quote, to develop the concept of capital, it is necessary to begin not with labor, but with value, and precisely with exchange value in an already developed movement of circulation, end quote. Marx. Grundrisse. Therefore, wholly within the terms of the conceptualization outlined above, in the Grundrisse, value could be considered as a product of abstraction, and the category of money as, quote, objective form of thought, end quote. However, in the Grundrisse, Marx had not yet developed the concepts required to clarify this. It was not one of the themes in the Grundrisse for which Marx proved supporting material. And where such concepts are found, namely in Capital, they're integrated into a way of presenting the argument which is based on the assumption of a presupposed actual value. Therefore, as the Grundrisse phrases it, of a, quote, labor which has become true in practice, end quote. This is not the end of the puzzle, however. The development of the decisive category, namely that of money, turns out to be completely inadequate in the Grundrisse. Marx himself points this out when he says, quote, it will be necessary later, to correct the idealist manner of the presentation, which makes it seem as if it were merely a matter of conceptual determinations and of the dialectic of these concepts, above all in the formulation, product, or activity becomes commodity. Commodity, exchange value, money. End quote. Marx. Marx leaves no room for doubt that the money form arises, quote, out of necessity, end quote, from the process of exchange. Quote, money does not arise by convention any more than the state does. Money arises out of exchange and arises naturally out of exchange. It is product of the same, end quote. And also, quote, the necessity for a value form first develops with the increase in the number and variety of commodities entering into the process of exchange. The problem and the means for the problem's solution arise simultaneously, end quote. Marx. But Marx provides no methodologically satisfactory development of the money form. In order, therefore, to elaborate Adorno's program, it would be necessary to combine 1. The way in which the argument is presented in the Grundrisse, one in which Marx sees a closer connection between gradually established, in which Marx sees a closer connection being gradually established in circulation between an autonomously determined exchange value and abstract labor conceived as becoming true in practice. Two, the concepts which Marx develops in Capital and which are introduced within the framework of a way of presenting the overall argument which differs from that of the Grundrisse. What exactly are the new concepts in Capital which must be considered? In Capital, Marx operates with a concept of validity, Geltung, which, as far as terminology is concerned, cannot be overlooked. Just as in the appendix, quote, the value form, end quote, which is on this channel, published in the first edition, Marx refers to validity more than 30 times in various word combinations. However, Marx explains this concept of validity only indirectly by means of references and examples. As early as the first edition, Marx also attempted to relate the twofold character of labor to this concept of validity. Quote, what follows from the above is that there are not two different types of labor hidden inside the commodity. Rather, the same labor is determined in different and opposing ways. After it has been applied to the use value of the commodity as its product, or to the commodity value as its mere opposing expression, respectively. Just as the commodity must, above all, be an object of use in order to have value, so must labor, above all, be useful labor in order to count as expenditure of human labor power, and therefore as human labor as such. End quote. Marx, Capital. Marx deleted this passage in the second edition and thereby basically substantialized abstract human labor as the substance of value, elevating such labor to a quasi-ontological category. Quote, on the one hand, all labor is, speaking psychologically, an expenditure of human labor power, and in its character of identical abstract human labor, it creates and forms the value of commodities. On the other hand, all labor is the expenditure of human labor power in a specific form and with a definite aim, and in this, its character of concrete useful labor, it produces use values, end quote. Marx. Money and validity. Can Simmel offer further help? Adorno indicated on more than one occasion that the central question about society should be an imitation of the ontological proof of the existence of God. At least in its Hegelian version, the most perfect being cannot be conceived without including its existence. Formulated in this speculative way, this raises the problem of the objectivity of abstraction, for objectivity should not only be understood as intersubjective validity, but should be understood precisely in terms of the philosophical discussion of the universal in re, i.e. the real existence of a universal. This may be the reason why Adorno never used the term, quote, real abstraction. He realized that there was more concealed behind this formulation, too readily used by the social scientists, than the latter would like to admit. Let us turn to a formulation by Hegel, a philosopher who was not yet plagued by inhibitions and who probably had no need to comply with scientific standards for fear of being excluded from the scientific community. Quote, money is the material, existing concept, the form of the unity of the possibility of all things, end quote, is the way it was put by the young Hegel. This did not remain as no more than one of Hegel's early speculative flourishes, since Hegel repeated these thoughts much later in his lectures on the philosophy of law. As a, quote, existing concept, end quote, money is at the same time characterized as a, quote, existing universal, end quote. Hegel. Hegel stated it even more precisely when Hegel said, quote, here value exists as such, end quote. Furthermore, quote, in this way, money is the real existence of the universal. The universal is not only an external, objective universal, but also a subjective universal, a completely different type of universal, end quote. This, quote, completely different type of universal, end quote, is therefore simultaneously totality and abstraction, just like the, quote, I, das Ich, end quote, as existing concept, a unity of, quote, unrestricted infinity of absolute abstraction or universality, end quote, and the, quote, transition from undifferentiated indeterminacy to the differentiation, determination, and positing of determinacy as a content and object, end quote. Hegel. However, precisely not as, quote, I, but as thing. It is only the philosopher who is permitted to discover this universal as really present, bracket, in re, and bracket, in the economy sense. As an expert on the universal, the philosopher has in any case a license to engage in speculative flights of thought, question mark. Excuse me. Is it only the philosopher who is permitted to discover this universal as really present, bracket, in re, and bracket, in the economy, since as an expert on the universal, the philosopher has in any case a license to engage in speculative flights of thought? Or can the social scientist also use such a concept? The young Marx uses identical formulations, quote, money as the existing and active concept of value, ... of all things, end quote. Marx. Marx writes in the economic and philosophical manuscripts, a phrase which could just as easily have come from Hegel. Money is also defined as an existing universal in the Grundrisse. Quote, this totality exists in money itself as the comprehensive presentation of commodities. Thus, wealth, exchange value as totality as well as abstraction, exists, individualized as such, to the exclusion of all other commodities, as a singular tangible object in gold and silver. Money is therefore the god among commodities, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. Money, quote, as the individual of general wealth, end quote, is not only a form, but at the same time the content itself. Quote, the concept of wealth, so to speak, is realized, individualized, ... in money, the price is realized, and its substance is wealth itself, considered in its totality, in abstraction from its particular modes of existence. End quote. Even the first edition of the first volume of Capital, in which the dialectical method was already, quote, much less in evidence, end quote, contains a passage, deleted in the second edition, which deals with the development of the universal form of equivalence, and which could not have been any clearer. Quote, in Form 3, which includes the converse second form, the linen, however, appears as the generic form of the equivalent for all other commodities. It is as if, in addition to lions, tigers, hares, and all other real animals, which formed into groups, built up the various sexes, species, subspecies, families, etc. of the animal kingdom, the animal also existed. The individual incarnation of the entire animal kingdom. Such an individual, which in itself includes all real species of the same object, is the universal, such as animal, God, etc. End quote. Marx. Marx's formulations, from the earliest critiques of political economy all the way through to Capital, also refer to this actually existing universal by using almost exactly the same expressions as are employed by Hegel. However, how is such abstraction, as a practical operation carried out by those doing the exchange, to be conceived and justified? I have suggested above that Marx uses a concept of validity in Capital, which he does not clarify, but which could give us access to a solution. However, let us first of all look at the possible solution offered by a philosophical text which explicitly discusses the connection between money and validity, namely Georg Simmel's The Philosophy of Money. Simmel is the only neo-Kantian philosopher of value who has taken the trouble to investigate the problem of value in the economy, according to Adorno, the actual locus of the entire philosophy of value. Simmel characterizes this value which exists in our consciousness as a, quote, objective value, end quote, and at the same time expressly as a, quote, metaphysical category, end quote, since, as something objective, value belongs between the subject and the objects. Quote, in fact, money is a third category, which cannot be derived from either subject or object. I misspoke. Quote, in fact, it is a third category, which cannot be derived from either subject or object, but which stands, so to speak, between us and the objects, end quote. Simmel. However, where is this third category actually to be found? The neo-Kantian obviously has the appropriate answer ready. Quote, I have observed that the value of things belongs among those mental contents that, while we conceive them, we experience them at the same time as something independent within our representation, end quote. Simmel. Here Simmel repeats the consciousness proposition, namely that we have something in our consciousness, but which is perceived within our consciousness as being outside of our consciousness. According to Simmel, an objective value gains that objective value's objectivity simply through, quote, the basic capacity of the mind, to separate the mind self from the ideas that the mind conceives, and to represent these ideas as if these ideas were independent of its own representation." End quote. Simmel. The concept of validity as conceived by Simmel therefore refers to the, quote, content of a representation, end quote, which does not coincide with the, quote, representation of contents, end quote. The contents are therefore not annulled, regardless of whether or not they are represented, and for this reason they are, quote, valid, end quote. Simmel. How then does it happen that the value which, according to the follower of the subjective doctrine, is something that is felt, bracket, ein empfundenes, end bracket, sets itself at such a distance within the subject that value gains an objective reality? What should surely be developed is precisely this, quote, remarkable ability, end quote, of the mind, first elevated to philosophical consciousness with the more precise stating of the concept of validity, quote, to think of contents as being independent of the act of thinking. This is one of its primary qualities which cannot be reduced any further, end quote. This, quote, remarkable ability, end quote, is not, for its part, to be determined independently of the more precisely stated phenomenology of the validity of value, because objective values being, sein, like that of any other value in the philosophy of value, should only exist in being valid, bracket, im gelten, end bracket. Its, quote, suprasubjective character contains a, quote, primary phenomenon, end quote. The, quote, existence, end quote, of which is inextricably connected with an a priori illusion. Quote, value exists in our consciousness as a fact that can no more be altered than can reality itself, end quote. Simmel. As soon as this value, quote, exists as a fact, end quote, this value is perceived as a, quote, economic value, end quote, which, quote, attaches, end quote, to an object. Simmel stresses that value in this specific objectivity originates only in exchange, simultaneously with the exchange process itself. Quote, exchange, i.e. the economy, is the source of economic values because exchange is the representative of the distance between subject and object, which transforms subjective feelings into objective valuation, end quote. Simmel. Value, originally a confused feeling, suddenly represents value self through exchange as a, quote, objective quantity without any quality, end quote. It, quote, attaches, end quote, to the object, but is, at the same time, a thought, which, however, appears independently of the act of being conceived. What exactly is this, quote, remarkable, end quote, appearance of value, this something of the mind that attaches to objects? And how does the a priori illusion arise that is connected with this, quote, metaphysical category, end quote? How does it arise in this form of suprasubjective validity existing within our consciousness, and yet appearing within our consciousness as being outside consciousness and simultaneously connected to objects to which it, quote, attaches? Naturally, Simmel's explanation has given rise to much criticism, which will not be discussed here. What we will consider, however, is whether this account of valid value abstraction is identical to Marx's conception of value, when the latter states that equivalence only means equal magnitude, quote, after both objects have first been reduced tacitly in our head to the abstraction, quote, value, end quote, end quote. Marx. A more precise formulation would have been desirable, but note that Marx does not refer to an abstraction in our consciousness, although also stressing that it takes place, quote, tacitly, end quote. Abstraction can, therefore, be seen as an action that takes place in the mind, although we are not conscious of this abstraction. Abstraction is therefore a logically unconscious process, a lack of awareness within awareness itself. Marx draws our attention to this in Capital when he says, quote, by equating their different products to each other in exchange as values, men equate their different kinds of labor as human labor. They do this without being aware of it, end quote. Marx. Footnote. This is the basis of an experience which sociology is also trying to work through theoretically in relation to phenomenological and functionalist conceptions. Habermas, for example, says explicitly that hermeneutical sociology is idealist if hermeneutical sociology is not supplemented by a concept of the systematic integration of the unplanned consequences of social actions which result from the use of a monetary medium. It must be pointed out here that the theoretical consideration of this problem cannot be restricted to this, quote, initial abstraction process, end quote. Rather, a, quote, theory of these unplanned additional consequences, end quote, which can be formulated on the basis of Marx's critique, is only possible and meaningful when this, quote, secondary abstraction process, end quote, is dealt with, together with the question of what are the, quote, actual values, end quote, produced by abstract universal labor. End footnote. What does Marx refer to when he states that humans equate their different kinds of labor as human labor? That humans equate humans' different products as values, and that humans equate their different products as values without an adequate consciousness of doing so. Does this lack of awareness refer to the equating of labor, or rather to the equation of products as values, or to the connection between value and labor, or that therefore the equating of products as values is done consciously, but the reduction to equal labor is done unconsciously? New section. Money as unity of objective positing and universal acceptance. Let us try to clarify how in Marx's text this act of abstraction is conceived in the practice of exchange. In this regard, I will refer to the conception of simple circulation found in the Grundrisse and its twofold meaning, which becomes evident only in the course of this long and hastily written manuscript. On the one hand, this exchange value positing interaction is to be understood from a historical perspective, but not in the sense of mundane historical description, canonized in Marxist orthodoxy as the relation between logic and history, following some unfortunate formulations by Engels. It is much rather to be understood as the interlinking of a development logic and a development dynamic, which was, however, not explicitly worked out by Marx. On the other hand, Marx links the idea of simple circulation with the conception of a, quote, surface, end quote, of the total reproduction process of capital, an approach which is clearly modeled on Hegelian logic. Many formulations even suggest that Marx adopted Hegel's exact words. For example, in his discussion of the transition to capital, which is modeled on Hegel's account of the transition from the logic of being to the logic of essence. Footnote. Quote, money in money's final completed character now appears from every aspect as a contradiction. From every aspect as a contradiction which dissolves that contradiction's self, drives towards that contradiction's own dissolution, end quote, Marx. And In, quote, transition to essence, end quote, Hegel states, quote, but we are already familiar with this self-sublating of the determination of indifference in the development of its positiveness. This determination has shown this determination's self to be from every aspect a contradiction. This determination is in itself the totality in which every determination of being is sublimated and contained, end quote. Hegel. When Marx later describes his relationship with Hegel, to which Adorno refers, as flirting with Hegelian language, this is not only an understatement, but also very misleading, because the correspondence of the conceptual construct goes far beyond mere flirting. Just as every determination of the logic of being is sublimated in the logic of essence, so Marx also wants to show that the sphere of simple circulation proves, over time, to be an abstraction. Quote, considered in itself, circulation is the mediation of pre-posited extremes. But it does not posit these extremes. It itself must be mediated as the totality of mediation, as total process. That is why its immediate being is pure appearance. It is the phenomenon of a process running behind its back. That is why circulation's immediate being is pure appearance. Circulation is the phenomenon of a process running behind circulation's back. Circulation is now negated in each of circulation's moments, as commodity, as money, and as the relation of commodity and money, as the simple exchange of commodity and money, circulation, end quote. End footnote. In both accounts, Marx proceeds on the assumption that commodities enter the exchange process as, quote, available products or commodities, end quote. In the first, as products which become commodities, and in the second, surface of the capitalist reproduction process, as commodities which, quote, look like, end quote, products. In what follows, I will refer to the former. On a number of occasions, Marx repeats the following idea, quote, the product becomes a commodity. The commodity becomes exchange value. The exchange value of the commodity is the commodity's immanent money property. This, the commodity's money property, separates the commodity's money property self from the commodity in the form of money and achieves a general social existence, end quote. Marx. Further traces of this argument can be found in Capital. Quote, in the direct exchange of products, each commodity is a direct means of exchange to that commodity's owner, and an equivalent to those who do not possess that commodity. ... At this stage, therefore, the articles of exchange do not acquire a value form independent of those articles' own use value, or of the individual needs of the exchangers. The necessity for this value form first develops with the increase in the number and variety of the commodities entering into the process of exchange. The problem and the means for its solution arise simultaneously. Commercial intercourse, in which the owners of commodities exchange and compare their articles with various other articles, never takes place unless different kinds of commodities belonging to different owners are exchanged for and equated as values with one single further kind of commodity. This further commodity, by becoming the equivalent of various other commodities, directly acquires the form of a universal or social equivalent, if only within narrow limits. The universal equivalent comes and goes with the momentary social contacts which call it into existence, is transiently attached to this or that commodity in alteration, but with the development of exchange it fixes itself firmly and exclusively onto particular kinds of commodity, i.e., it crystallizes out into the money form, end quote. Marx. At the same time, Marx points out that, quote, the proportions in which they are exchangeable are first quite a matter of chance, end quote. Quote, the proportion in which they are exchangeable are first quite a matter of chance, end quote, and that the objects, which are exchangeable through the, quote, mutual desire of their owners to alienate them, end quote, therefore, and this sentence is found only in the first edition, quote, obtain the form of something exchangeable before they are developed as values, end quote. Only later are they, quote, fixed as, quote, magnitudes of value. We also find in Marx a discussion of the usual ways in which economists attempt to, quote, derive the origin of money from the exchange process. Marx is, of course, aware of these and reflects with bitter ridicule on the prevailing doctrine. Quote, economists usually reason that the emergence of money is due to external difficulties which the expansion of barter encounters, but they forget that these difficulties arise from the evolution of exchange value, and hence from that of social labor as universal labor. For example, commodities as use values are not divisible at will. A property which exchange values they should possess. Or it may be that the commodity belonging to A may be use value required by B, whereas B's commodity may not have any use value for A. Or the commodity owners may need each other's commodities, but these cannot be divided, and their relative exchange values are different. In other words, on the plea of examining simple barter, these economists display certain aspects of the contradiction inherent in the commodity as being the direct unity of use value and exchange value. On the other hand, these economists then persistently regard barter as a form well adapted to commodity exchange, suffering from merely certain technical inconveniences, to overcome which money has been cunningly devised. Proceeding from this quite superficial point of view, an ingenious British economist has rightly maintained that money is merely a material instrument, like a ship or a steam engine, and not an expression of a social relation of production, and hence is not an economic category. It is therefore simply a malpractice to deal with this subject in political economy, which in fact has nothing in common with technology, end quote. Footnote, an analysis critique of economic technicism is found in Eamon's analysis of Schumpeter's methodological individualism. End footnote. What must be borne in mind is that this critique by Marx stems from 1859, before Marx evolved the new ways of presenting his argument in Capital. But how is the formation of money to be conceived if only surplus products are, quote, thrown into the fire of circulation from outside, end quote? As Marx stated in the Grundrisse. As has been pointed out above, Marx also proceeds on the assumption of an exchange of products by the product's producers, which gradually changes into exchange of commodities. And this development corresponds to a change of the money form, namely the use value which assumes the money function. Footnote, quote, hence my product becomes dependent on the state of general commerce and is torn out of its local, natural, and individual boundaries. For exactly that reason, it can cease to be a product, end quote. And this development corresponds to a change of the money form, namely the use value which assumes the money function. End footnote. Quote, money does not arise by convention any more than the state does. Money arises out of exchange, and arises naturally out of exchange. Money is a product of exchange. At the beginning, the commodity will serve as money, i.e., the commodity will be exchanged not for the purpose of satisfying a need, not for consumption, but in order to be re-exchanged for other commodities, which is most frequently exchanged and circulated as an object of consumption, and which is therefore most certain to be exchangeable again for other commodities, i.e., which represents within the given social organization wealth par excellence, which is the object of the most general demand and supply, and which possesses a particular use value. Thus salt hides cattle slaves. In practice, such a commodity corresponds more closely to itself as exchange value than do other commodities. A pity that the difference between denrée and marchandise cannot be neatly reproduced in German. It is the particular usefulness of the commodity, whether as a particular object of consumption, hides, or as direct instrument of production, slaves, which stamps it as money in these cases. In the course of further development, precisely the opposite will occur, i.e., that commodity which has the least utility as an object of consumption or instrument of production will best serve the needs of exchange as such. In the course of further development, precisely the opposite will occur, i.e., that commodity which has the least utility as an object of consumption or instrument of production will best serve the needs of exchange as such, end quote. Marx. Here Marx shares the common opinion according to which the, quote, most marketable commodities, end quote, parenthesis, A. Menger, end parenthesis, acquire the function of acting as money, at least in the original stages of the development of money. How must Marx's argument proceed in order to avoid falling prey to the accusation of monetary technicism which Marx levels at the economists? Only by connecting the idea of this original product exchange with the concept of validity in capital. If value is supposed to be a product of abstraction, which arises in the, quote, minds of people, end quote, but is nevertheless not, quote, abstracted, end quote, consciously, this process of equating need not be conceived according to the model of nominalist ideas. Value is not a generic term that includes the specific. Nor is abstraction, therefore, a process that, quote, abstracts out, end quote, the universal. Value is, as will be discussed later, a universal, but value is constituted unconsciously. The act of equating takes place in a manner which remains obscure to the participants themselves. They simultaneously constitute and discover value in a process which is to be conceived, in terms of Hegel's logic of essence, as a unity of positing and external reflection. Marx expressly refers to the nature of the categories of reflection, and from his presentation, it follows directly that Marx, like Hegel, understands the process of positing reflection as an objective one in the sense of logical unconsciousness. The external reflection, then, is a conscious reflection on that which is posited as something which is discovered. Vorgefundenes. Marx explains this by means of an example. Quote, determinations of reflection of this kind are altogether very curious. For instance, one man is king only because other men stand in the relation of subjects to him. They, on the other hand, imagine that they are subjects because he is king, end quote. The process which Marx gives as an example would be interpreted differently today, but the nature of his explanation vividly depicts what matters. The constituting act, the positing, remains unconscious, and is rather itself the prerequisite for a conscious reflection, which then, as external reflection, incorporates the prerequisite only as that which is discovered. The way in which Marx introduces this example within the context of his presentation shows clearly that Marx does not understand this reflection process as being specific to exchange, but on the contrary, as a universal process which is also an element in the exchange process. How is this reflection process depicted in the exchange process? Marx stresses that, quote, one forgets that the magnitudes of various objects can only be compared quantitatively once they have been reduced to the same unit. It is only as expressions of the same unit that they are magnitudes of the same name, therefore commensurable magnitudes, end quote. The unit is there to start off with, as is assumed correctly in the presentation in Capital, since here Marx begins with values produced by a presupposed abstract universal labor, but is produced in a, quote, natural operation of the mind, end quote. Although in somewhat crude formulations, Marx points out that people do not construct this unit consciously, but produce this unit in a manner appropriate to the nature of their thought processes. If we therefore have categories of reflection that are also part of the exchange process and that prove their validity, this must involve a double movement of thought in which these categories are posited separately and at the same time as a unit, a non-changing change, in which difference and unity are constructed simultaneously in the same process. In Capital, Marx operates with both, quote, opposing and at the same time mutually dependent forms, end quote, the relative value form and the equivalent form, but already within a context in which value is presupposed, so that the equivalent form is determinable as a value expression. If we assume, as Marx does in some remarks in the first edition, which were deleted in the later editions, that the products, quote, obtain the form of something exchangeable, before the products are developed as values, end quote. The persons doing the exchange first of all construct the form itself, the, quote, form of equal validity, bracket, Form der Gleichgeltung, end bracket, end quote. A, quote, form of equal validity, bracket, Form gleicher Geltung, end bracket, end quote. They construct, quote, equal validity, bracket, gleiche Gültigkeit, end bracket, end quote. Marx also describes this form of equal validity as a form of direct exchangeability, quote, the form of equal validity, therefore also of exchangeability, end quote, a form in which they are non-differentiated, equivalent. However, since this does not concern any equating, but equating specifically in the exchange process, this relation of equality must be a value relation at the same time. This is exactly what Marx says this, quote, relation of equality is, a value relation, end quote. And this means that the value as a unity conceived in the mind is immediately posited as a twofold one. It is only non-equivalent within an ongoing thought process, within which equivalence is established, quote, in that it equates itself as value with the other commodities, it refers to itself as value. In that it refers to itself as value, it simultaneously distinguishes itself from itself as use value, end quote. Contrary to the Neo-Kantian characterization of the validity of value as something demanding recognition, bracket, Anerkennung Eischendes,
which is always already in our consciousness. Marx's concept of validity refers exclusively to the process of creative value positing, to the constitution of a form which, as such, cannot enter our consciousness, cannot be perceived. The logical unconscious process of unity positing is not accessible to the, quote, natural consciousness, end quote. Here, some subtle nuances must be observed. In the case of unity positing, the product, against which the exchange is made, the opposing exchange value, is, in its material form, directly regarded as value, the commodity in the form of direct exchangeability. Quote, does not first of all need to assume a form which is different from its direct natural form in order to appear as value in respect of other commodities, to be valid as value and to act on these as value. End quote. Marx tries to explain this process by means of an example. Quote, in a certain sense, a man is in the same situation as a commodity, as he neither enters into the world in possession of a mirror, nor as a Fichtean philosopher who can say, quote, I am I, end quote. A man first sees and recognizes himself as a man through his relation to another man. Peter only relates to himself as a man through Peter's relation to another man. Paul, in whom Peter recognizes his own likeness. With this, however, Paul also becomes from head to toe, in Paul's physical form as Paul, the form of appearance of the species man for Peter. End quote. One second, I'm going to copy that. Sorry, I know this is annoying to listen to. Okay. Sorry about that. In considering this footnote, the question arises as to whether Marx's argument, detached from Marx's argument's explanatory character, is convincing. However, what this is actually about, what this comment shows actually in its very contestability, what Marx is trying to explain here is the direct unity of the specific and the universal between use value and value. The comment referred to in the above example, quote, the curious thing, about the reflection of categories, end quote, namely that, quote, being equivalent, is, so to speak, only a reflection category of the linen, end quote, but that it actually, quote, appears, end quote, in reverse, is an explanation of the external reflection. That which is posited is discovered. The equivalent form appears to belong to the object by virtue of the object's very nature. The king appears to be the natural person to be the king. Is the equivalent form, quote, perceived at all, however? Quote, because they considered that in the equation of value, the equivalent always has the form of a simple quantity of some article, of a use value. Bailey and many of his predecessors and followers were misled into seeing the expression of value as merely a quantitative relation, whereas in fact the equivalent form of a commodity contains no quantitative determination of value. whereas in fact the equivalent form of a commodity contains no quantitative determination of value, end quote. Marx. Emphasis by Helmut Reichelt. The equivalent form is such as the form of direct exchangeability, which, in our consciousness, coincides directly with the use value. The object is valid. The object is valid exclusively as objectivity, as direct objectivity of the value. What is perceived, however, is only the object. The form of equal validity, or also the form of direct validity of value is, therefore, the object is value objectivity, bracket, Wertgegenständlichkeit. But this is not in our intentional consciousness. The value objectivity as such is not, quote, perceived, end quote. The value objectivity is nevertheless, quote, registered, end quote, but registered in the form of a sensory object, precisely because the real object is valid as objectivity. As an external reflection, consciousness takes over categories of the object, conventional dimensions, and treats them, the categories of the object, as categories of objectivity. The people doing the exchange are therefore not aware of what the people doing the exchange are doing. That is, of the people doing the exchanges, thoughts are doing. Of what the people doing in the exchanges thoughts are doing. As people acting intentionally, their consciousness is concentrated on the objects in front of their eyes, the quote, commodities, end quote, of the economists. Within this structural situation, the people doing the exchange are, however, obliged to engage in a process of equating, which is at the same time a value positing act, or which they themselves are unaware. Here what we have is, quote, exchange value positing interaction, end quote, in contrast to, quote, exchange value positing labor, end quote. Although the microstructure of the abstraction process in the comparison of two exchange products will be developed as the, quote, nucleus, end quote, of money, we still have not yet arrived at the money form itself. How is this process to be conceived in order to understand this act of positing as constitutive of the money form itself as well? The first chapter of the first edition of Capital concludes with a comment that commodities have up to this point been viewed analytically, quote, sometimes from the point of view of use value, sometimes from the point of view of exchange value, end quote. Marx adds, however, that the subject of further examination will be the, quote, real relationship of the commodities to one another, end quote. And this is, quote, their exchange process, end quote. The aim of the, quote, analytical contemplation, end quote, of commodities, from the point of view of exchange value, was to prove the development of an equivalent form which, in that equivalent form's universality, corresponds to the universality of the concept of value. Footnote, quote, it is only through its universal character that the value form corresponds to the value concept, end quote. Marx. End footnote. The aim of the, quote, analytical contemplation, end quote, of commodities from the point of view of exchange value was to prove the development of an equivalent form which, in that equivalent form's universality, corresponds to the universality of the concept of value. In the presentation of the, quote, actual relationship, end quote, that is, the presentation of the reality of the formation of money, the relationship between exchange value and use value, must be discussed. The formation of a universal equivalent form must simultaneously take place by, quote, selecting, end quote, a corresponding use value. A comment made in the second chapter of Capital, Volume 1 is important in this context, although its theoretical significance has not been recognized in the literature of Marx. Marx emphasizes that, quote, only the action of society can turn a particular commodity into the universal equivalent, end quote. This refers to the use value of the money commodity, and the social action refers to the conscious selection of an object which is suitable for the money function. Such an argument would have to be rejected if it implied that money was consciously devised as a means to reduce the complexity of the exchange process. Money would then be a technical medium based on the universal acceptance of a specific use value. However, universal acceptance is not identical with universal validity. Universal validity, for its part, is bound to universal acceptance. The, quote, specific usefulness, end quote, which, quote, stamps, end quote, the object, quote, as money, end quote, simultaneously universalizes and standardizes the movement of thought about the equating process which is present in the minds of all people carrying out an exchange. The form of direct exchangeability becomes a universal equivalent form. The unity of all commodities exists as a specific alongside the multiple. Money is a sensory supersensory phenomenon. As something with validity, money is, and money is only, because money is valid. The material is valid as value objectivity, and the value objectivity exists as object. Marx characterizes this process of the formation of the universal equivalent form in the appendix to the first edition of Capital as follows, quote, This exclusion can be a purely subjective process, For example, a process by which the linen owner assesses the value of the linen owner's own commodity, linen, in terms of many other commodities. In contrast to this, a commodity is in general equivalent form 3, only because and insofar as that general equivalent form commodity itself is excluded as equivalent by all other commodities. The commodity in the general equivalent form is excluded as equivalent by all other commodities. The exclusion is here an objective process. Which is independent of the excluded commodity. Hence, in the historical development of the value form, the general equivalent form may pertain now to this and now to that commodity. But a commodity never functions in fact, werklich. werklich, as general equivalent, except insofar as that commodity's exclusion, and therefore that commodity's equivalent form, is a result of an objective social process. End quote. Emphasis by Marx. The definition of the economic categories given at the beginning, namely that they are, quote, subjective objective, end quote, and a, quote, objective form of thought must be read before this passage from the appendix. The subjective process of equating, taking place, quote, in the head, end quote, of the linen owner, when the linen owner equates the linen owner's linen with all other products, a process through which all other products become equivalent forms. Although these forms obviously only exist, that is, are valid in his thoughts, does not become an objective process in the sense that it walks out of his head and materializes in a mystical manner. The objectivity of the process exists in the reversal, by which a commodity becomes a universal equivalent form. This, however, is still a thought process. The, quote, form of thought, end quote, becomes objective. Typically enough, Marx later speaks of a, quote, objective social process. A, quote, objective social process, end quote. Emphasis by Helmut Reichelt, by means of which both aspects are conceived together, the objectivity of the reversal and the selection of the specific use value, which is suitable as the money form, the unity of both processes, namely the constitution of universal validity and the establishment of universal acceptance, is summarized by Marx in the phrase, quote, general social validity. General social validity, end quote. Quote, we see that the actual money form proper offers, in the actual money form self, no difficulty at all. Once we have understood the general equivalent form, we do not need to rack our brains to understand that this equivalent form attaches this equivalent form's self to a specific type of commodity such as gold, and still less insofar as the general equivalent form, in the general equivalent form's very nature, requires the social exclusion of a definite commodity by all other commodities, and still less insofar as the general equivalent form, in the general equivalent form's very nature, requires the social exclusion of a definite commodity by all other commodities. It is now only a matter of this exclusion winning an objectively social consistency, and general validity, and hence does not concern different commodities in turn, concern different commodities in turn, nor possess a merely local reach, Tragweite, in only particular areas of the world of commodities, end quote. Marx. The general equivalent form as a form of exchangeability, existing in a specific use form, in other words, a generally valid direct form, shows signs of that reversal which Marx understood in the first edition of Capital, Volume 1, as a characteristic of a universal, and which he more precisely designates with the Hegelian term, quote, inclusion, end quote, bracket, Einbegreifens, end bracket, end quote. Quote, an individual object which in itself includes all real existing types of the same object is a universal. For example, animal, God, etc. End quote. The specific is not subsumed under an abstract universal, but is, quote, included, end quote, and with that, the specific is simultaneously abstraction and totality. The conditions which I referred to at the beginning of this article have therefore been fulfilled. The so-called real abstraction is an objective concept which, as the direct unity of validity in being, bracket, sein, end bracket, goes beyond the common idea of objectivity as intersubjective validity, and which satisfies the demanding philosophical requirements of simultaneously existing as a universal. If, therefore, we abandon the Baedeker version of Marx, it becomes clear that in Capital, Marx has the conceptual means at Marx's disposal for the first time to realize Marx's earlier theoretical characterization of money as, in words identical to those of Hegel, quote, the existing concept of the value of all things, end quote. What is also realized or stated more precisely is what Adorno called, quote, objective abstraction, end quote, namely a, quote, conceptuality which holds sway in reality, bracket Sache, and bracket itself, end quote, and which provides a necessary starting point for further explication of the dynamics of the exchange principle. A footnote says the phrase Baedeker version of Marx is a phrase which Adorno liked to use in lectures to point out that authors should always be read differently to whatever way is customary. According to Wikipedia, when I looked up Baedeker, it says Verlag Karl Baedeker, founded by Karl Baedeker on the 1st of July 1827, is a German publisher and pioneer in the business of world travel guides. The guides often are referred to as simply Baedekers, a term sometimes used to refer to similar works from other publishers or travel guides in general, contain, among other things, maps and introductions, information about routes and travel facilities, the description of noteworthy buildings, sites, attractions, and museums, written by specialists. Not end footnote, but back to the text. Give me one moment. New section. Existing universal versus real abstraction. What exactly is the difference between Marx's, quote, objective concept, end quote, and Simmel's, quote, real abstraction, end quote? Simmel explicates the phenomenon of the validity of value in the first few pages of his Philosophy of Money, but then explains that it develops in this abstract form only with money. Wikipedia says The Philosophy of Money, published in 1900, is a book on economic sociology by German sociologist and social philosopher Georg Simmel. Considered to be the theorist's greatest work, Simmel's book views money as a structuring agent and helps people understand the totality of life. I'm actually going to read a substantial bit from this Wikipedia because it's very important to this paper. I've never read Simmel. I'm not saying this information may not be accurate, but it's the best I can do right now. First section of the Wikipedia is titled Money and Value. Simmel believed people created value by making objects, then separating themselves from those objects, and then trying to overcome that distance. Simmel found that objects that were too close were not considered valuable, and objects that were too far away for people to obtain were also not considered valuable. What was also considered in determining value was the scarcity, time, sacrifice, and difficulties involved in getting objects. In the pre-modern era, beginning with bartering, different systems of exchange for goods and services allowed the existence of incomparable systems of value: land, food, honor, love, etc. With the advent of a universal currency as an intermediary, these systems became these systems became reconcilable, as everything tended to become expressible in a single quantifiable metric, its monetary cost. New section in the Simmel Wikipedia. Money and freedom. The fundamental point of the philosophy of money, is that money brings about personal freedom. The effect of freedom can be appreciated by considering the evolution of economic obligations. When someone is a slave, their whole person is subject to the master. The peasant has more freedom, but if they are to provide the lord with payments in kind, such as wheat or cattle, they must produce exactly the item required, or barter that item at a great loss or inconvenience. But when the obligation takes a monetary form, the peasant is free as to whether to grow wheat or keep cattle or engage in other activities as long as they pay the required tax. Which, as we know, many peasants have lost their farms through strictly economic via economic compulsions, backed by the state, of course. Freedom also arises because money enables an economic system of increasing complexity in which any single relation becomes less important and thus more impersonal. As a result, the individual experiences a sense of independence and self-sufficiency. There is another sense in which money is conducive to freedom, and it originates from the observation that the owner is truly entitled to its possessions only if he takes care of its upkeep and of making it bear fruits. Money is more flexible than land or other assets, and thus it frees the owner from those activities that are specific to real entities. Since monetary possessions no longer ties the owner to a specific type of work, money leads to increased freedom. Consequently, monetary ownership enables the position of a purely intellectual worker, and, by the same line of reasoning, it also implies that a wealthy man can lead a modest life. As for workers and managers, they only contribute work for wages and only deal with an impersonal market, and thus their personality is separated from specific work activities. In case of civil servants, they are paid a fixed salary that is largely independent of any specific work performance and see their personality freed from work activities. The same holds for artists, such as a musician who is paid the same fee regardless of how well he plays. Although the monetary system enhances individual freedom, the monetary system can also lead to consequences that are questionable. An employee does not necessarily have better living conditions than a slave does, as a precise amount of money corresponds imprecisely to its effective purchasing power. In a money economy, individuals will tend to put their financial interests above the goals of society or of the state. If a peasant sells his land even for a fair price, monetary freedom differs from the personal activity afforded by possession of the land. More generally, freedom from something does not necessarily equate with the freedom to do something else, because money is, quote, empty, end quote, and flexible, and does not direct the owner toward any specific activity. Although monetary payments can free from the obligations of specific in-kind contributions, it has also the effect of removing the involvement of the individual from a broader context. For example, when the Athenian vassal states had to contribute with ships and troops, the tributaries were directly involved in Athens' foreign and military policy, as at least to the extent that drafted soldiers could not effectively be deployed against their home states. Once the military contribution was replaced by a monetary tribute, no such constraint could be placed on Athens' policy. The natural evolution of this state of affairs is that despotic regimes tend to favor a monetary economy. New section of the Simmel Wikipedia. Personal values can be quantified in terms of equivalent money amounts. An example is the Wertgeld the monetary value that must be paid to a family if one of his members is killed. The Wehrguilt was truly a reflection of personal values, in this case of a lost life, rather than the compensation for the income stream that the deceased would have provided to the family. Similarly, personal values are also quantified by the practice of marriage, by purchase, and of prostitution. However, the historical trend has been toward an increased awareness of individual distinctions, whereas money is intrinsically fungible. As a result, money has been progressively considered as an inappropriate equivalent to personal values, and most of these practices have fallen into disuse. When these practices survive, the amount of money is so large that it introduces an affective element in the transaction. A wife purchased for an exorbitant amount is especially dear to the heart. Money is fungible, and as such, money stands in sharp contrast with the idea of distinction, according to which an entity is set apart from and incomparable with a majority. Distinction is a property of nobility, or of some works of art, for example. Simmel takes as a case in point the House of Lords, which functions as the sole judge of its members and at the same time refuses to sit in judgment of any other individual. In this sense, the Lords value distinction to the extent that even the exercise of authority on other people would be seen as a degradation. The quantitative aspect of money has the potential to threaten and debase the qualitative notion of distinction. New section. Style of life. As values can be quantified in monetary terms, our relationship with objects has lost most of its emotional character and has become more intellectual. On the one hand, our rational attitude can lead us to become individualistic, to an atomization of society, and even to disregard respect and kindness. On the other hand, there are often clear advantages in relying on intellect rather than emotions. At any rate, Simmel maintains that intellect is a tool, and as such, it lacks an intrinsic sense of direction and can be put to use for different purposes. Rationality originates from the objective, purely arithmetic nature of money, and is mirrored by the tenet that law is equal for everyone and that in a democracy all votes are equal. The ability of fitting in an increasingly intellectual environment is reinforced by education, which in turn is mostly accessible to those who can afford education. As a result, money can lead to the creation of a de facto aristocracy of the affluent. The converse is that egalitarian tendencies typically reject the money system. The objective nature of money ultimately arises from the division of labor, in which the product is divorced from the worker's personality and work is treated as a commodity. Similarly, products are no longer tailored to the specific customer and do not reflect the customer's personality. Production tools are specialized to the point that the worker has little leeway in the way he operates the machines, and fashion changes so rapidly that nobody gets personally or socially attached to it. This state of affairs stands in contrast with the arts, which reflect the individuality of the author. Money can increase the distance between individuals to the point that it allows them to fit in crowded cities and liberate individuals from the yoke of working on a family business. Incidentally, financial activities are concentrated in major cities, and the concentration of money increases the pace and variety of life. Humankind has become progressively more independent of the rhythms of nature and more dependent on the business cycle. Quote, objects and people have become separated from one another, end quote, declares Simmel, and was to compare this phenomenon with Marx's theory of alienation. Money rises above individual conflicts while being an essential participant of the conflict. It has transcended its characteristics of a tool when money has become the center around which the economic system rotates, at which point it also takes the role of an all-encompassing teleological circle. Simmel was to compare this phenomenon with Marx's commodity fetishism. Yet, division of labor makes it possible to construct intellectual and scientific contents that surpass the ability of the individual mind. Even in these cases, though, it may be essential that a synthesis be accomplished by a single mind. Similarly, as material concerns become impersonal, what is left can become more personal. For example, as the typewriter has relieved the writer from the cumbersome mechanics of writing, he can devote more attention to the original contents of his work. It really depends on humankind whether money will lead to increased distinctiveness and refinement or not. New section of the Simmel Philosophy of Money Wikipedia. Social effects of money. Simmel's outlook, while gloomy, is not wholly negative. As money and transactions increase, the dependence of an individual decreases as he is drawn into a holistic network of exchange governed by quantifiable monetary value. Paradoxically, this results in greater potential freedom of choice for the individual, as money can be deployed toward any possible goal, even if most people's sheer lack of money renders that potential quite low much of the time. Money's homogenizing nature encourages greater liberty and equality and melts away forms of feudalism and patronage, even as it minimizes exceptional, incommensurable achievements of art and love. Okay, back to the text. So I only read the first sentence of this section, so I'm going to restart it. New section, existing universal versus real abstraction. What exactly is the difference between Marx's, quote, objective concept and Simmel's, quote, real abstraction? Simmel explicates the phenomenon of the validity of value in the first few pages of his philosophy of money, but then explains that it develops in this abstract form only with money. Simmel's point of departure is the same as Marx's, a direct exchange of products which is gradually expanded. But he has no account which corresponds to Marx's discussion of the change from subjective to objective, quote, form of thought, end quote. It is, however, through this change and the inversion which accompanies it, that value is constructed as an existing universal. Simmel's real abstraction, however, quote, contents itself, end quote, with the point that the direct unity of an object with the subjectively interpreted value is a value experience. Quote, in the primitive stages of the economy, use values appear as money, cattle, salt, slaves, hides, etc. Whatever the way in which money has evolved, in the beginning, money must have been a value directly experienced as such. End quote. Simmel. Money must have been a value directly experienced as such. End quote. The point of departure for the development is always the unity of the, quote, value experience, end quote, with the object which serves as money. Quote, money could not have developed as a means of exchange or as a measure of value unless money's material substance had been experienced as immediately valuable, end quote. Simmel. However, is this also the point of departure for the development of the objective value? Simmel emphasizes that it would be a serious misunderstanding to interpret this unity in the sense of the, quote, independent value of each, end quote. It would only be the, quote, error of this substantialist interpretation, end quote, which is, as far as method is concerned, the same, quote, as that which asserts a direct connection between an individual and the content of any right, The individualistic conception of the, quote, rights of men, end quote, provides an example, end quote. Simmel. For in the further development of the exchange process, it becomes clear that this substance gives way to function, that the object experienced as being valuable was only a carrier, in the end a symbol. Quote, it may appear self-evident today that symbols should be created by segregating the quantitative aspects of things, but this is in fact an achievement of the human mind, which has remarkable consequences. The institution of money depends upon it, inasmuch as money represents pure quantity in a numerical form, regardless of all the specific qualities of a valued object. An account from ancient Russia illustrates a very characteristic transition from the qualitative to the quantitative symbolic representation. Originally, marten furs served as a means of exchange. As trade developed, the size and quality of individual pelts lost all significance for their exchange value. Each pelt simply equaled any other, and only the number of pelts mattered. Eventually, only the tips of the pelts were used as money, and finally pieces of leather, probably stamped by the government, circulated as a means of exchange. This clearly illustrates how the reduction to a quantitative viewpoint supports the symbolization of values, which is the basis for the genuine realization of money, end quote. The substantialism, end quote, Simmel. The substantialism at the beginning is therefore an unavoidable, but nevertheless, quote, erroneous interpretation, end quote, since it is no different at the beginning than with an object experienced as being valuable. The object itself is, insofar as it assumes a money function, always already a symbol, which then also develops over time. Quote, the preceding argument has not yet touched upon the question as to whether in reality money has value or not. Money was only meant to show that the function of money in measuring values does not impose upon it the character of being itself a valuable object, end quote. Simmel. But what does money symbolize? Money symbolizes relations, just as it is, quote, irrelevant whether a scale to measure space consists of iron, wood, or glass, since only the relation of its parts to each other or to another measure concerns us, so the scale that money provides for the determination of values has nothing to do with the nature of its substance, end quote. Simmel. And in this connection, Simmel quietly smuggles in another concept of value. Suddenly, it becomes a value, quote, that objects acquire by objects' exchangeability, end quote. And the, quote, significance of money is only to express the value relations between other objects, ... independent of any intrinsic value, end quote. Simmel. This, quote, distilled exchangeability of objects, end quote, is therefore, to begin with, conceived as quantitative equivalence, which is likewise sublimated over time into progressively more abstract relations. Quote, it is indeed correct that the quantities of different objects can be compared only if they are of the same quality. Wherever measurement is done by direct comparison of two quantities, it presupposes identical qualities. But wherever a change, a difference, or the relation between two quantities is to be measured, it is sufficient for their determination that the proportions of the measuring objects are reflected by the proportions of those measured, and there need be no qualitative identity of the objects. The two objects with different qualities cannot be equalized, but two proportions between qualitatively different things may be equalized. End quote. Simmel. This is the origin of Simmel's idealism. Simmel emphasizes the direct unity of value and substance. Quote, thus the ancient Irish, when they entered into relations with the Romans, made their own value unit. The cow, equivalent to an ounce of silver, end quote. Simmel. However, Simmel is unable to distinguish between the, quote, most marketable commodity, end quote, as an object in the objectively posited form of universal, immediate exchangeability, and this same object is the object of value experience. The cow is indeed a direct value unit, but since the cow's nominal and real value later part company in subsequent development, the idea of the unity of value and the object can only have been the, quote, error of a substantialist interpretation, end quote. The relation is therefore inverted, and objectively posited, direct unity of value objectivity and object is not the condition for the possibility of the establishment of relations, but the valid abstract relations which have already been conceived as being differentiated must become, quote, embodied, end quote. Money derives money's, quote, content from money's value. It is value turned into a substance, end quote. Simmel. If Adorno's assumption is correct that economic value is to be conceived as the actual starting point of the neo-Kantian philosophy of value initiated by Lotze, then the key to the foundation of Adorno's thesis should be found in Simmel's philosophy of money. Sorry, I'm looking to see who this Lotze is. Okay, so there's a Hermann Lotze. This might be him. Was a German physician and philosopher. He is one of the central figures of academic philosophy in the 19th century. He is one of the best known and most discussed philosophers worldwide until the 1920s. In comparison to the protagonists of German idealism, or the philosophers of the 19th century who worked outside the academic tradition, Hermann Lotze is less well known today. However, Hermann Lotze's intellectual achievements, in particular the foundation of the inter- and transdisciplinary concept of values that is used worldwide today, also have a significant influence on our culture and ethics today. So I'm assuming that's the Lotze that's being referred to. Anyway, if Adorno's assumption is correct that economic value is to be conceived as the actual starting point of the neo-Kantian philosophy of value initiated by Lotze, then the key to the foundation of Adorno's thesis should be found in Simmel's philosophy of money. I have mentioned above that the neo-Kantian concept of validity as the, quote, remarkable ability, end quote, elevated to philosophical consciousness, as the, quote, primary quality, end quote, of our mind, quote, which cannot be reduced any further, end quote, quote, to think of contents as being independent of the act of thinking, end quote, is not to be determined. For its part, I gotta repeat something. I've mentioned above that the Neo-Kantian concept of validity as the, quote, remarkable ability, end quote, elevated to philosophical consciousness, as the, quote, primary quality, end quote, of our mind, quote, which cannot be reduced any further, end quote, quote, to think of contents as being independent of the act of thinking, end quote, is not to be determined, for its part, independently of the precise phenomenology of the validity of value. Objective value, which like every other value in the philosophy of value, should exist only as validity, is in its, quote, suprasubjective, end quote, character a, quote, primary phenomenon, end quote. Simmel. Its, quote, existence, end quote, is inseparably linked with an a priori manifestation. Therefore, for Neo-Kantianism, the separation of factuality and validity is the last word. This chlorismos, bracket separation and bracket itself, however, is something posited in the sense of the Hegelian objective reflection. Simmel rightly assumes that this, quote, metaphysical category, end quote, of value, which is, quote, discovered as a fact, end quote, in our consciousness as a, quote, objective value, end quote, which, quote, attaches, end quote, to objects, appears as a concept which seems to be independent from the act of thinking, and which should, as something objective, insert itself between subject and object. In other words, something which, quote, in fact, is a third category, which cannot be derived from either subject or object, but which stands, so to speak, between us and the objects, ... end quote. In the specific form of Simmel, end quote, Simmel. In the specific form of validity, only within the context of the economy, exchange process. Simmel shares this unreflective concept of reality with the economists, a concept which only knows objects, goods which are exchanged, a, quote, technological, end quote, process. Simmel therefore has in mind, similar to Hegel's, quote, natural consciousness, end quote, a, quote, objective reality, end quote, of objects, which Simmel compares with the, quote, consciously perceiving subject, end quote. But how do we get to the, quote, value concept, end quote, as a fact which seems to be independent in our consciousness from the act of thinking and to the form of a, quote, objective abstract value, end quote, portrayed so precisely by Simmel? The latter assumes that the development starts with the unity of the object and the, quote, value experience, end quote, the substantiality of which should turn out to be an error. In the case of metal currency, this is then the gold quantity, which directly coincides with a value quantity, with a value amount. The money amount is the gold amount. With the process of symbolization, however, this substantial unity disintegrates. Money becomes the sign. But where does this leave the gold quantity of the measure of value? The value amount, which previously existed as direct value objectivity, as objective appearance, survives as objective appearance in the concept, as a, quote, abstract objective value, end quote, which seems to exist independently of the act of being conceived. Still, Simmel changes this appearance into something primary, which is discovered in consciousness as a fact, a valid objectivity which only exists in our consciousness, but which is conceived in our consciousness as having value existence outside it. Simmel's Neo-Kantianism, the complete separation of being and validity, is in itself, as Hegel would have said, only a way of formulating appearances which are involved in the circulation of money. What is decisive for economic theory is how the concept of validity is understood, only as the validity of value in our consciousness, as in the case of Simmel, or in the sense of the objective positing of the validity of value, as outlined above, and which constitutes the object as value objectivity. New section. Dialectical development as presentation of the autonomization of value. The structural presentation of the argument of capital was established long before Marx conceived this concept of validity of value. Contrary to the conception of simple circulation and its twofold meaning as outlined in the Grundrisse, in capital only one aspect is still relevant for the presentation. No longer simple circulation as historical prerequisite for capital, but how, quote, within the bourgeois mode of production, simple circulation itself exists only as determined by capital and is determining it, end quote. There appears to be a footnote that I missed. That last quote was from Marx and Engels. No, excuse me, Marx. The footnote that I missed is a quote. It says, quote, the simple circulation, merely the exchange of commodity and money, the exchange of commodities in mediated form, precisely because it is only mediating movement between presupposed points of departure, can, up to the formation of hordes, historically exist without exchange value taking hold of the production of a people, whether on the whole surface or in its depths. At the same time, however, historical development shows how circulation itself leads to bourgeois, i.e. exchange value positing, production, and creates for itself a basis other than that from which it directly sprang. The exchange of surpluses is commerce creating exchange and exchange value. However, it extends only to the act of exchange itself and runs alongside production itself, end quote. Marx and Engels. Oh no, I didn't miss a footnote. It was the footnote was earlier in the last sentence I read, so I'm in business. Anyway, end footnote. This implies that Marx already proceeds on the basis that commodities are the product of capital. In other words, that value is the objectification of the abstract universal labor of the laborer. The concept of value derived from this conception is a precondition for the structural organization of the argument and cannot be introduced as a concept of validity. Validity can only be isolated as a central theme within the context of the process of circulation, as the starting point and prerequisite for the development of a labor value theory, in which abstract universal labor and labor time can likewise still be developed from the validity conception of value, and do not, as in the Ricardian version of Marx's critique of the economy, generally accepted until now, remain disconnected from another. The conception of the Grundrisse, however, which establishes a connection between, quote, labor as such, end quote, a form of universal direct exchangeability, and the, quote, practical truth of abstract labor, end quote, as exchange value positing labor, provides access to a version which fits in with both meanings of the concept of simple circulation, and which can link the, quote, theoretical and practical truth, end quote, of abstract labor within the concept of validity. Footnote. If we develop value as abstraction, the universal equivalent form is existing universal, then specific labor as the presentation of universal labor can also be decoded as the implication of the existing validity of value. For objects, as surplus products, are obviously also labor products, and the commodities, since they have a price, present themselves by dint of the universal equivalent form as the specifics of a unity. What is the, quote, substance, end quote, of this unity? Since the use value, which assumes the function of the universal equivalent form, is also a labor product, this specific labor directly functions as universal labor, and the specific labors as the specifics of the one universal labor. Marx's formulations, and not only those of the first edition, clearly show that that he understood the concept of universal labor as an implication of the concept of validity. Quote, just like the linen, therefore, became the individual equivalent, just like the linen before became the individual equivalent as a result of another commodity referring to the linen as the appearance form of value, so it becomes, as the appearance form of the value common to all commodities, the universal equivalent, universal value body, universal material of abstract human labor. The universal equivalent, universal value body, universal material of abstract human labor, end quote. Marx, emphasis by Marx. Marx went on to say, quote, the specific labor materialized in it is therefore now valid as the universal realization form of human labor, as universal labor, end quote. It must be pointed out, however, that this concept of universal labor is not identical to the, quote, labor as such, end quote, in the Grundrisse. End footnote. For this is the true meaning of the dialectical development, which is to be understood as the methodologically reflected presentation of the increasing autonomy of exchange value, and which, for Marx, when Marx wrote the Grundrisse, was identical to the depiction of the emergence of capitalist society. Footnote, quote, the transition from capital to landed property is also historical, since landed property in landed property's modern form is a product of the action of capital on feudal, etc., landed property. In the same way, the transition from landed property to wage labor is not dialectical but historical. In the same way, the transition from landed property to wage labor is not only dialectical but historical. Since the last product of modern landed property is the general introduction of wage labor, which then appears as the basis of the whole business, end quote. Marx letter to Engels, 2nd of April, 1858. End footnote. The dialectical presentation of the autonomization of value could also concretize Adorno's thesis. Is not society that is, quote, intelligible, but, quote, only the law of autonomization, end quote. Contrary to sociology, which at best uses the words, quote, becoming autonomous, end quote, to characterize the mode of operation of bureaucratic organizations from the point of view of their conduct, that is, simply to formulate an everyday experience. Adorno defines society itself as, quote, that which has become autonomous, end quote. Adorno. Footnote. In the corresponding theoretical language, this is the intensification of system complexity as the institutionalization of new levels of system differentiation as perceived from the internal perspectives of the, quote, life worlds, end quote, in question. See Habermas, 1987, end footnote. Adorno defines society itself as, quote, that which has become autonomous, end quote. In this concept of society, which Marx first formulated in the economic and philosophical manuscripts, although in language that encouraged misinterpretation. It is this concept of society which Marx first formulated in the economic and philosophical manuscripts, although in language that encouraged misinterpretation. Being a chiasmus, Marx tries to understand capitalism as a structurally unsurpassable apex of a topsy-turvy world in which the laborer, i.e., every laborer, simultaneously and directly through his labor, produces the very opposite of that which he, as a sensory aware being, observes and intends as he interacts with the material and living world of his fellow human beings. According to the internet, Wikipedia has an entry. According to Wikipedia, a chiasmus, in rhetoric, chiasmus are less commonly known chiasm, from the Greek crossing, quote, to shape like the letter X, end quote, is a, quote, reversal of grammatical structures in successive phrases or clauses, but no repetition of words, end quote. A similar device, antimetabole, also involves a reversal of grammatical structures in successive phrases or clauses in an ABBA configuration, but unlike chiasmus, presents a repetition of words. Back to the text. Footnote. Chiasmus is a rhetorical figure in which a given order of words is first stated and then reversed. For instance, Marx says that in capitalism, producers relate to each other through their products, and thus commodity fetishism involves, quote, material relations between persons and sociological relations between things, end quote. Excuse me, I think I said that wrong. Quote, material relations between persons and social relations between things. Material relations between persons and social relations between things, end quote. So I'll repeat the last sentence. Using a chiasmus, Marx tries to understand capitalism as a structurally unsurpassable apex of a topsy-turvy world in which the laborer, i.e., every laborer, simultaneously and directly through his labor, produces the very opposite of that which he, as a sensory-aware being, observes and intends as he interacts with the material and living world of his fellow human beings. This reversal is the result of an autonomization, which Marx characterizes generally as estrangement. In the German ideology, scarcely 2 years later, he expresses the same thoughts in a different way. Quote, the reality which communism is creating is precisely the true basis for rendering it impossible that anything should exist independently of individuals, insofar as reality is only a product of the preceding intercourse of individuals themselves. End quote. End quote. Footnote. Marx and Engels. End footnote. Marx already points out in the economic and philosophical manuscripts that this entire topsy-turvy world is to be developed out of money. Footnote, quote, "We now have to grasp the essential connection between private property, greed, the separation of labor, capital and landed property, exchange and competition, value and the devaluation of man, monopoly and competition, etc. The connection between this entire system of estrangement and the money system." The money system, end quote. Marx. End footnote. However, how this is to take place remains completely open. Instead, using the concept of the division of labor and Adam Smith's idea of accumulation, a materialist theory of history is sketched out, in which all past social history is conceived from the perspective of this culmination point, as the gradual result of embryonic and simplistic versions of this inverted form of sociality. The Grundrisse can be seen as the first attempt to implement in detail this insight of the economic and philosophical manuscripts, an attempt continued in Capital, where strange labor is presented as the structural apex of this theoretical concept. An interpretation of this dialectical presentation must try to maintain clarity about the interconnections between that which is conscious intentional and that which detaches itself from consciousness. The aim is to avoid objectivism in all objectivism's varieties, and at the same time to maintain Adorno's characterization of society as, quote, that which is unintelligible, end quote, or to put Adorno's formula more precisely, to reconstruct the, quote, law of the autonomization of society, end quote, as the only, quote, rationally understandable, end quote, aspect of a social process of irrationalization. Adorno, however, never clarified this idea. What can, quote, understand, end quote, mean when what is involved is the reconstruction of the unintelligible? That Adorno's, quote, dialectical concept of meaning, end quote, itself has been dialectically conceived, that is, meaning has been restricted to that which appears, has been indicated above. However, how is this, quote, societal essence which shapes appearances, appears in them, and conceals itself in them, end quote, to be comprehended in its dynamics? The accusation of essentialism cannot be made to stick if one succeeds in proving the development of a, quote, objective conceptual, end quote, that blocks itself off from the hermeneutic access, but which simultaneously unfolds its own logicality, bracket, logicitet, end bracket, in and through the actions of individual subjects. The development of Marx's categories and Marx's criticism of the economists must be seen against this background. In his accusation that they grasp the categories only in an external way, Marx repeats Hegel's criticism of the philosophy of understanding. In contrast to reason, understanding analyzes patterns of action in an external way as fixed and absolute. Individual subjects are presupposed as completely formed and are presumed to confront fully developed categorical forms. But the truth is, however, that new categories emerge historically and are associated with the emergence of new forms of subjectivity. If, however, the categories are grasped in only a fixed and external way, then the general context within which forms of subjectivity are determined must also be treated as fixed. Rather than subjects who pursue their goals in truly rational strategies, we have instead the narrow economics of rational choice. The narrow economics of rational choice. Marx's language in the Grundrisse is in keeping with this intention. We repeatedly find terms such as the following, quote, undeveloped, end quote, value, in the, quote, further development of exchange value, end quote, quote, exchange value in its movement, end quote, quote, exchange value becoming independent in money, end quote, quote, completed exchange value, end quote. These formulations certainly provoke the accusation of objectivism, but nevertheless we should understand these expressions as an adequate linguistic portrayal of an objective dynamic. The objectivity involved is based precisely on the logical unconsciousness of the subjects who, by means of their conscious actions, drive this process forward. Programmatically, the following can be observed. If we understand exchange value as having become independent, as a really existing universal, then Marx's concept of capital is based exclusively on the, quote, movement, end quote, of this value, which represents the starting point and central impulse of the social dynamic, which can then, in Adorno's words, be characterized as the, quote, societal essence which shapes appearances, appears in appearances, and conceals itself in appearances, end quote, only in agreement with wholly in agreement with Marx's intentions. Wholly in agreement with Marx's intentions. For Marx, the concept of capital and the associated method of developing categories were linked simultaneously to the idea that the concept of capital adequately accounts for the dynamics of the real autonomization of value, starting from a, quote, existing principle, end quote, of exchange value becoming autonomous in the process of circulation. Marx traced its process of development and its self-generated legitimacy to the point where he was able to anticipate its endogenously generated collapse. Quote, we are present at the process of its, bracket capitals and bracket becoming. This dialectical process of capital's becoming is only the expression of the real movement through which capital comes into being. The later relations are to be regarded as developments emerging out of this germ, end quote, Marx. There's a footnote that I missed. It says, quote, to develop the concept of capital, it is necessary not to begin with labor, but with value, and precisely with exchange value, in an already developed movement of circulation, end quote, Marx. End footnote. Let us attempt to outline the individual steps of this development and, in doing so, to clarify certain concepts. The word, quote, movement, end quote, already provokes objections. How are we to understand movement if we do not substantialize value, and if we do not wish to comprehend this as something material in the so-called objective reality of the material world? It soon becomes clear that Marx's terminology as a whole cannot be detached from a conception of reality which is, so to speak, to be settled in this, quote, in-between realm, end quote, between the conscious intentional and the world of things. An objectivity connected to the validity attributed to the value of things as commodities. Only on this condition, value as value objectivity, can a conception be developed in which movement can also be conceived meaningfully, movement as a change of form. Marx calls this, quote, metamorphosis, end quote, in capital, and is reproduction of form. Correspondingly, words such as exchange and circulation should not be linked to imaginary content, but should be, quote, conceived, end quote, within the context of this conception. Exchange or simple circulation is the exchange of commodities as value objectivity, existing validity of value or value correctness, and which can, for this reason, also dissolve into nothingness, a, quote, evanescent movement, end quote, of which nothing remains behind. Quote, nothing remains other than the means of circulation as simple residue. But as such a residue, however, value loses value's specific characteristic form. Value sinks into matter, which remains as the inorganic ash of the entire enterprise, end quote. Marx. If, however, exchange and circulation cannot, for their part, be conceived independently of this movement, the movement must, should it preserve itself, that is, quote, develop, end quote, as value or become autonomous, in turn change this circulation itself, make this circulation permanent and expand this circulation. Simple circulation becomes, by means of value becoming autonomous, capitalist circulation, namely capital is that which circulates. Value is therefore a very, quote, airy, bracket, luftiges, insubstantial, a very, quote, airy, luftiges, insubstantial, end quote, creation. But value is so precisely because of this unusual quality. That is, that value is conceived as at the same time as, quote, real value, end quote, which only exists in circulation as that which is real, as value objectivity in various forms. In the Grundrisse, or capital, it says in the Grundrisse of capital. I don't know if that's a typo or if that's has like a specific meaning. Marx operates within this conceptual framework, and insofar as Marx moves at this abstract level, Marx also calls the specific characteristic forms resulting from this, quote, abstract specific characteristic forms, end quote. Footnote, quote, here we have only to comprehend money in money's abstract determinations of form, bracket, characteristic forms, end bracket, the laws regulating the distribution of precious metals on the world market imply economic relations in their most concrete form, something that still lies before us. The same applies to all the circulation of money, which it performs as capital, and not as universal commodity or universal equivalent, end quote. Marx. End footnote. The first steps of Marx's dialectical presentation can therefore be summarized as follows. 1. As has already been mentioned above, there is no strict, methodically satisfactory development of the money form in the Grundrisse. Marx simply assumes that this money form always develops as soon as products are thrown, quote, from outside into the fire of circulation, end quote. From the point of view of the preservation of value and the autonomization of value, these first two aspects are therefore evanescent forms. The exchange value of the commodity, insofar it is directly exchanged or, quote, circulated, end quote, via the mediation of the universal form, shows itself to be, quote, a merely implied determination, since the commodity becomes a fleeting exchange value only in circulation, end quote. Marx. The value is realized in the act of value's disappearance. 2. Money is independent of exchange value only in the form of the unity of the first and second aspect. In this, quote, specific characteristic form, end quote, it is the, quote, numerical indicator of a quantity of itself, which serves as unity, end quote. Marx. In this, quote, specific form,
its state as capital has already been included latently, end quote. Marx. For it is with this form that the, quote, bad infinity, end quote, of the movement of reproduction starts, which results from the contradiction of this form itself, as existing universal form is the absolute form of wealth, although it is simultaneously restricted as quantity. The movement exists in the infinite progress towards the absolute form of wealth by means of a consistent increase in size. Footnote. Given that historical and dialectical presentation are still treated as parallel in the Grundrisse, this form constitutes the actual point of departure for the dialectical development. Quote, money as individualized exchange value, and hence as wealth incarnate, was what the alchemists sought. It figures in this role within the monetary mercantilist system. The period which precedes the development of modern industrial society opens with general greed for money on the part of individuals as well as of states, end quote. Marx. Quote, in the mercantile system, gold and silver function ... as the measure of power of the different communities, end quote. Marx. See also Marx and Engels, 1980. Trade capital and the increase of wealth, the accumulation of gold as universal form of wealth, is therefore for Marx a necessary transitional stage in the development of capitalism. Because this dynamism is only given a jump start with money, in the third specific form whose dynamism subverts a static traditional society. Quote, the mania for possessions is possible without money, but greed itself is the product of a definite social development, not natural as opposed to historical. Hence the wailing of the ancients about money as the source of all evil, end quote. The concept of hence the wailing of the ancients about money as the source of all evil, end quote. Marx. The concept of abstract labor should also be considered against this background as a category which, quote, falls even further under our subjective reflection, end quote. Marx's interpretation of the history of theory still moves firmly within the conception of the economic and philosophical manuscripts as gradual insight into the actual sources of wealth. As long as the gold form of money functions as wealth per se, which can only be increased by means of exchange, labor is still not identified as the source of wealth. It is only with the physiocrats that this insight becomes manifest, although only in an indirect form, as the, quote, creative power of nature, end quote, which produces the net product. Adam Smith was the first to make the theoretical breakthrough. Quote, labor seems a quite simple category. The conception of labor in this general form, as labor as such, is also immeasurably old. Nevertheless, when it is economically conceived in this simplicity, quote, labor, end quote, is a modern category, as are the relations which create this simple abstraction. The monetary system, for example, still locates wealth altogether objectively as an external thing in money. Compared with this standpoint, the commercial or manufacture system took a great step forward by locating the source of wealth not in the object, but in a subjective activity, in commercial and manufacturing activity, even though it still always conceives this activity within the narrow boundaries as money-making. In contrast to this system, that of the physiocrats posited a certain kind of labor, agriculture, as the creator of wealth, and the object itself no longer appears in a monetary disguise, but as the product in general, as the general result of labor. This product, as befits the narrowness of the activity, still always remains a naturally determined product, the product of agriculture, the product of the earth, par excellence.
It was an immense step forward for Adam Smith to throw out every limiting specification of wealth-creating activity, not only manufacturing or commercial or agricultural labor, but one as well as the others, labor in general. With the abstract universality of wealth-creating activity, we now have the universality of the object defined as wealth, the product as such, or again, labor as such, but labor as past, objectified labor, end quote. Marx. Marx himself understands this as the theoretical conclusion of the development of a theory. This would be the self-consciousness of the commodity, according to Lukács, which, when stated more precisely in theoretical terms, reflects the actual transition to capitalist production. From these passages, it is also clear that Marx always links the concept of abstract labor to the production of surplus products, as he did in the economic and philosophical manuscripts, never with the idea of the, quote, simple production of commodities, end quote, as imagined by Engels. End footnote. Three, given this movement of form, the question arises as to how such a form is at all possible within the real process of circulation. The universal form can only be retained in that the universal form is exchanged for additional use values that are constantly being put into circulation. However, in this respect, it proves to be contradictory. If money is saved, it is simply the universal form which may prove to be the, quote, intended, end quote, universal wealth, or if it exchanges itself for real wealth, it disappears as a value which has been preserved and which has become independent. 5. Again, we are up against the problem which Marx sees hypothetically as follows, quote, in order to establish itself as something independent, the exchange value would not only have to emerge as a result from circulation, but would also have to be capable of re-entering circulation, to be retained in circulation, becoming commodity, end quote. Marx. And in another passage, Marx states, quote, its entry into circulation must itself be a moment of its self-preservation. Bei sich bleibens. End quote. The self-preservation of value is conceivable only as the constant change of form. Money as the universal form of objective value and use values as the specific form of objective value alternate constantly, and value preserves value self through the alternation of both forms. Quote, thus the exchange value is now determined as a process and not merely as an evanescent form of use value, indifferent to this use value itself as a physical content, end quote. Marx. 5. This movement of alternating forms would be only a, quote, formal, end quote, alteration if this movement of alternating forms are not accompanied by the movement of value reproduction referred to under point 3. The autonomy of value must be conceived as the unity of both these movements. This is, at the same time, the abstract concept of capital. Quote, the process of becoming autonomous appears not only in the form that capital confronts circulation as an independent exchange value, money, but also in that circulation is simultaneously the process of its becoming autonomous, that it stems from circulation as something having become independent, end quote. Marx. 6. Once again, we are faced with the problem, how is this movement possible as that which is real in the reality of the circulation? Both commodity and money are only forms of value, forms of its objectivity. Quote, it exists in the form of the objectivity, Gegenständlichkeit, but it is, quote, it exists in the form of the objectivity, Gegenständlichkeit, but it is indifferent to whether it is the objectivity of the money or the commodity, end quote. Thus, value can only preserve value's self as an independent process if the objectivity, which increases during the process, is maintained by a, quote, third, end quote. Quote, this third is not commodities, end quote. Seven. Since the objectivity of value is identical to the objectivity of universal labor, this, quote, third party, end quote, can only be found in opposition to this objectified universal labor. And, quote, the only opposite of reified labor is unreified labor, and the opposition of objectified and the opposite of objectified labor, i.e., subjective labor. End quote. I'm going to repeat that because there's italics in it. And, quote, the only opposite of reified labor is unreified labor, and the opposite of objectified labor, i.e., subjective labor, end quote. Marx. The following methodological observation, often quoted in the literature on Marx, is to be read in this context. Quote, but this historical stage in the development of economic production, whose product is already the free worker, is the premise of the emergence, and even more so for the persistence of capital as such. Its existence is the result of a lengthy historical process in the economic formation of society. It is made quite definite at this point that the dialectical form of presentation is right only when it knows its own limits. It is made quite definite at this point that the dialectical form of presentation is right only when the dialectical form of presentation knows the dialectical form of presentation's own limits, end quote. Marx. This also concludes the first part of the dialectical presentation. However, at the same time, it forms the transition to the presentation of that which has been arrived at in the previous argument as a new conceptual result. Marx continues, quote, the examination of simple circulation shows us the general concept of capital, because within the bourgeois mode of production, the simple circulation itself exists only as preposited by capital. And as prepositing it, the exposition of the general concept of capital does not make it an incarnation of some eternal idea, but shows how in actual reality, merely as a necessary form, it has yet to flow into the labor that creates exchange value, into production resting on exchange value, end quote. Marx. Marx states that it is not possible to draw a direct parallel between the dialectical development and the historical development which produced capitalism, modern landed property, and free labor. Dialectical development as a method for providing proof and historical presentation move in separate directions. As dialectical presentation, what is proved is that value, as something which has become autonomous and which is at the same time increasing, can only preserve itself by the constant addition of value by means of living labor. One moment. New section. Labor. Exchange value positing or twofold character. How are we to understand this living labor in conceptual terms? Marx correctly describes the discovery of this twofold character as a starting point for the critique of the political economy. At the same time, however, Marx had great difficulty in defining this twofold character. Let us look at the result of the dialectical presentation of the independence of value outlined above from the point of view that we must always understand this course of development as the validity of value, quote, held, end quote, in the circulation. This course of development shows that the process of reversal begins via the third aspect of money and expands constantly. First of all, consumption must be expanded. Quote, its disappearance must disappear and must itself be merely the means for the emergence of a greater exchange value, for the reproduction and production of exchange value, productive consumption. Then production will also be dragged into this process of the boundless increasing of value. Quote, production for the sake of production, end quote. The bad infinity of the irrational increase in value holds sway over the production process and structures the whole society. Just as each product is only valid as an objective form of value, each concrete act of labor is only valid as sensory activity which produces this objectivity. The boundlessness seizes living labor and effects an inversion, the infinite process, which arises from the futile attempt to achieve the absolute form of wealth through pure expansion, is transmitted to the labor process, which becomes no more than a necessary means of producing ever more objective value. Which formulation does Marx use for this in the Grundrisse? Use value, which stands in opposition to capital, is, quote, not this or another labor, but labor pure and simple. But labor pure and simple, abstract labor, absolutely indifferent to that labor's particular specificity. Bestimmtheit, but capable of all specificities. Of course, the particularity of labor must correspond to the particular substance of which a given capital consists. But since capital as such, is indifferent to every particularity of its substance and exists not only as the totality of the same, but also as the abstraction from all its particularities, the labor which confronts it likewise subjectively has the same totality and abstraction in itself, end quote. Marx. Every act of labor has the same validity. Every act of labor has the same validity, namely as the means for increasing value, as contributing to the abstract total mass of capital, which has various forms of existence, the commodity as a specific form, money as a general form. The equality of validity, Gleichgeltung, which is to be conceived rigorously on the basis of the previously developed inversion only, continues in living labor which now, for its part, is changed into its material activity. Quote, this economic relation, therefore develops more purely and adequately in proportion as labor loses all the characteristics of art, as labor's particular skill becomes something more and more abstract and irrelevant, and as it becomes more and more a purely abstract activity, a purely mechanical activity,
hence indifferent to its particular form, a merely formal activity, or what is the same, a merely material, stofflich activity, activity pure and simple, regardless of that activity's form, end quote, Marx. However, is this, quote, pure abstract, pure formal, pure material, end quote, activity already the twofold character? No! Exclamation point. No. This pure abstract, this, quote, pure abstract, pure formal, pure material, end quote, activity is only the changed character of the concrete activity under the compulsion of production for profit, production for the sake of production, in its concrete quantity. It becomes more mechanical and more abstract, but as such, this, quote, pure abstract, pure formal, pure material, end quote, activity does not create any value. It produces value because in this mechanical, still material activity, it produces more objects, and these as, quote, available commodities, end quote, in circulation are valid as more value in objective form. Just as each commodity has equal validity prior to money, so each act of labor has equal validity prior to capital, since the production of the additional objects is the means of producing increased value in objective form. The material, the use value is, in Adorno's words, quote, dragged along, end quote. Nothing can be done without the object, without the material. Thus the material must, so to speak, quote, persist, end quote, so that the, quote, independent value does not collapse incoherently into this independent value's self, end quote. And so that the production of value in objective form does not lose the production of value in objective form's secure basis. In the first edition of Capital, Volume 1, Marx still tries, as has been pointed out above, to use concepts of validity to characterize in a unified way the labor process which produces, quote, more objects, end quote, and therefore also, quote, more value in objective form, end quote. In the second edition, we find only the determination of abstract universal labor formulated in an absolute way as, quote, expenditure of human brain, nerves, muscles, end quote. This suggests that Marx's formulation, the twofold character of labor, which he introduces in the contribution, does not serve to further clarify this source of the, quote, actual value, end quote, but in fact hinders access to it. How are we to explain this? Did Marx fail to understand his own principle? Or did Marx believe in his efforts to popularize capital that a physiological determination of labor would be easier to grasp? Whatever the case may be, it has consequences for Marx's argument. Already in the Grundrisse, insofar as in the Grundrisse Marx makes presuppositions about the concept of value, Marx assumes that value is the same as the magnitude of value, and this is determined according to socially necessary labor time. This, however, is only implemented as a regulating principle in a developed capitalism where the, quote, law of the exchange of value asserts itself only in its antithesis, end quote, that is, in competition. If this concept of value, as a combination of labor power and necessary labor time, as the measure for the magnitude of value, is assumed, then the transition to industrial capital must also fail.
insofar as we also want to interpret the dialectical development as a historical course of development as Marx originally conceived it. This is the reason for the gradual formalization of the transition in Capital. The universal form becomes the universal formula. If value is understood in terms of the meaning of the concept of validity we find in Capital, then the dialectical development can be read as proof of the necessary transition of capital to production. However, this transition must not necessarily lead to capitalism, insofar as labor is carried out by slaves, a more severe labor process is imposed on them. We find a blending of these two conceptions in Capital. Marx proceeds on the basis that commodities are the products of capital. Marx assumes, therefore, that value is, quote, materialized, objectified, universal labor time, end quote. Footnote. This is a footnote that I missed. The structuralist argument of Jacques Bidet, following Althusser, proceeds from this problematic. The aim for Bidet is to furnish proof that the only function of dialectics is to conceal an epistemological break between two structures that do not necessarily go together, the capacity of production to shape the market and capitalism. End footnote. The, quote, derivation of the money form, end quote, can now essentially be conceived more elegantly from a methodical standpoint. At the same time, however, this derivation becomes more opaque, since linking this concept of value with the constitutive abstraction carried out by agents engaged in exchange can no longer be mediated. Footnote. Hachiro Masaki observed this break, but interpreted it at the same time as a methodological necessity. I was seeing if I could find anything on Hachiro Masaki, but I couldn't. Where the hell am I? End footnote. This is expressed indirectly in crude formulations, typically in the presentation of the exchange process as the, quote, true relation between commodities, end quote. Where Marx again refers back to his analysis of the commodities in the first chapter, namely that, quote, the natural laws of the commodity have manifested themselves in the natural instinct of the owners of commodities, end quote. Marx. This biologism has an almost symptomatic character. It simultaneously conceals and reveals the impossibility of mediation between these two concepts of abstraction. If, however, the dialectical presentation, as a development of the autonomization of value, becomes more and more, quote, concealed, end quote, and if the concept of validity is not linked to the overall structure of the argument,
What remains then of dialectics as the method of furnishing proof? Given that in the presupposed concept of value, he always assumes that socially necessary labor time is the measure for the magnitude of value and therefore already arises from developed capitalism. Marx shows that the exchange of equivalents in the sense of equal magnitudes of value cannot explain the increase in value, contradiction of the universal formula, but that this is an illusion appearing in simple circulation. This is then, quote, proven, end quote, in the presentation of the accumulation process, in that Marx shows that the entire process is based on the appropriation of unpaid surplus labor, end quote. The laws of appropriation or of private property, become changed into their direct opposite through their own internal and inexorable dialectic. The exchange of equivalents, the original operation with which we started, is now turned around in such a way that there is only an apparent exchange. End quote. Marx notes in the footnote on the next page that Cherub Louise Trebouilliez Sorry, I'm trying to see who. God, the internet in this house is fucking worthless. Marx notes that in the footnote on the next page that Trebouilliez discussed this connection as a central theme, but that in his work the, quote, dialectical reversal is not correctly developed, end quote. It is to these facts that Adorno refers when Adorno repeatedly states that, quote, capitalism is both not at all weird and at the same time very weird indeed, end quote. New section. Economy and sociology and the pretense of simple circulation. Although the expression, quote, simple circulation is no longer to be found in Capital, the persistence of its conceptual content is clear. In the Grundrisse, Marx merely developed the, quote, abstract specific characteristic forms, end quote, in the dialectical presentation as various forms of the autonomization of value until, quote, money and money's final completed character now appears in all directions as a contradiction which dissolves itself, drives towards its own dissolution, bracket, in the transition to industrial capital, end bracket. In Capital, we find a conception of, quote, value development, end quote, which is to be interpreted as subtle concretization, the objective positing of universal direct exchangeability, which constructs the object as value objectivity, so that the conventional standards of the object obtain specific direct economic form, quote, develops, end quote, into coins.
1 second. Quote, "The prices or quantities of gold, in which the values of commodities are ideally changed, are therefore now expressed in the money names, or the legally valid names of the subdivision of the gold standard made for the purpose of reckoning. Hence, instead of saying that a quarter of wheat is worth an ounce of gold, people in England would say that it's worth £3, 17 shillings and 10 pence. 1 second. Sorry. In this way, commodities expressed by their money names how much they are worth, and money serves as money of account whenever it is a question of fixing a thing as a value, and therefore in its money form. The name of a thing is entirely external to the thing's nature. I know nothing of a man if I merely know that his name is Jacob. In the same way, every trace of the money relation disappears in the money names pound, thaler, franc, ducat, etc. The confusion caused by attributing a hidden meaning to these Kabbalistic signs is made even greater by the fact that these money names express both the values of commodities and, simultaneously, aliquot parts of a certain weight of metal, namely the weight of the metal which serves as the standard of money. On the other hand, it is in fact necessary that value, as opposed to the multifarious objects of the world of commodities, should develop into this form, a material and non-material form, but also a simple social form." End quote. The coin name, quote, "as such," end quote, is already contained in the direct unity of value objectivity and object. But why is it necessary for value to assume this form? It results from the directness of the unity between object and objectivity. The sum of the value is the quantity of the gold, and the money standard is therefore initially purely conventionally weight as value objectivity. However, it requires, quote, "universal validity," end quote. The various weights are fixed and are given legal names which then take over the economic function. This form is purely conventional since it is measured as a quantity of metal which, in its pure materiality, is directly valid as a value quantity, and as coins whose names do not reveal their origin. This is in contrast to gold, which, as international currency used to balance international finances, returns to its, quote, "original form of bullion," end quote, so that, quote, "its mode of existence becomes adequate to its concept," end quote. Marx. We find an analogous quote, "assumption of form," end quote, in the concretization of the second money function. In other words, money used as means of circulation. The characterization of money in this second determination as the, quote, "realization of value at the moment of value's disappearance," end quote, is used repeatedly in the Grundrisse, and is the abbreviated version of the, quote, "medium of circulation theory," end quote. The creation of value in this insubstantial way, bracket, luftige Wertgebilde, dissolves without the persons involved being conscious of the process. They believe that they have only exchanged products. This idea is then central for the development of money as the medium of circulation and in the form of the coinage.
Since it only mediates the exchange, gold in this function is already a symbol, quote, in itself, end quote. Since, quote, its substance consists only in the constant but evanescent appearance of this vehicle of mediation, end quote. It is, from the very beginning, a symbol of itself, an object which is directly valid as value objectivity. The, quote, realized price, end quote, in circulation, and an object which is immediately exchanged again for a use value. In this function, gold itself is symbolic, a representative of itself, which as such can therefore also be replaced by other symbols. Soft paper lurks, so to speak, in the hard metal, since the, quote, material money as mere medium of exchange is itself symbolic, end quote. Marx. Contrary to the narrow economistic reading, which completely rejects questions of categorical development and which conceptualizes value only in Ricardian quantitative terms, it is clear that Marx's critique of the economy has two dimensions. One, as a theory of the autonomization of, quote, real value in circulation, it is a presentation of the real relations and assumes a necessary connection between value and money. It is this connection which forms the initial prerequisite for the formulation of labor value theory. The latter, however, in terms of the mode of presentation of the argument in the Grundrisse, is derived from the way in the development of the concept of capital is understood. In addition, it is only on the basis of such a premise that Marx's critique of classical political economy in the first volume of Capital becomes comprehensible. He argues that they never questioned why this content, labor, assumes the form it does, and why, therefore, labor time is shown in the magnitude of the value of the product. Marx's scientific critique of economic theory is in sharp contrast with this. The development of the coin name in symbolic money, briefly referred to above, presupposes the commodity. If we assume, however, that the commodity as the direct unity of object and value objectivity can no longer be perceived by the senses, that it presents itself to the, quote, natural consciousness, end quote, as object, the, quote, consciousness, end quote, can then, quote, imagine, end quote, that it is capable of creating money itself in that metal is minted and given a coin name. Footnote. In Knapp, I don't know if that's how you pronounce it, Knapp, in 1921, we find the legal version of Simmel's conception of money. Sorry. Okay. Wikipedia says Georg Friedrich Knapp was a German economist who in 1905 published The State Theory of Money, which founded the Chartist School of Monetary Economics, which argues that money's value derives from money's issuance by an institutional form of government rather than spontaneously through relations of exchange. Okay, back to the text. Like Simmel, Knapp assumes that the development of money starts with a valuable material. Analogously to Simmel, Knapp criticizes the metallist as being substantialists who fail to see that metallism is already also a hidden nominalism. Quote, the natural man is a metallist. The theorist, on the other hand, is forced to become a nominalist because it is not always possible to define the unit of value as a given quantity of metal. End quote. Knapp. Money is therefore created by means of conscious positing, in that specific quantities of metal are, quote, treated, end quote, by state authorities as names. Quote, the state therefore treats the older debts as if the unit of value, a pound of copper, were only a name by the use of which the relative amount of debt was indicated, and which does not mean that in reality copper has to be delivered. The state reserves to itself the right to order that, quote, a pound of copper, end quote, should now mean that a given weight of silver was to be paid, end quote. Money is therefore created through the nominality of the unit of value, end quote. Knapp. The unit of value is always nominal. Friedrich Bendixson agrees with him, but emphasizes, however, that this intensifies the theoretical problem. It is true that the unit of value, the unit of calculation, or the unit of currency are, from a formal point of view, magnitudes set by the state, but what is a unit of value? For the metallist, a unit of value is the same as a quantity of precious metal. According to Wikipedia, Friedrich Bendixson was a German economist and banker. Back to the text. Quote, however, the metallist economist too must acknowledge that with that formulation, only the legal shell, not the economic core of the unit of value, is described. His task is to expose this, end quote. The economist must explain what it means when values are transferred, when payments are made. Quote, however, it is really the abstract unit of value, the unit of calculation, called the mark, that is transferred when payments are made. In my opinion, this question must be answered in the negative. In truth, we can no more transfer units of calculation or units of value than meters or kilograms. Logic requires that the material to be transformed in meters or kilograms be known. One must be able to say which material is to be transferred in the units of value. The view that the payment is a transfer of units of value as such leaves behind an unsolved riddle in the searching mind, end quote. This riddle, as before, awaits a solution. For a unit of value, a unit of currency is a unit of real quantity of money, which precisely is not made up of paper notes. This quantity of units of value, which first appears to nominalists no longer fixated on the material as an objective quantity, is located by Simmel in consciousness, however, as an objective quantity of value which, as the content of the idea, is not identical to the idea of the content, a metaphysical category. End footnote. What we have, therefore, is a form of the economic process which Marx characterizes in the Grundrisse as the illusion of simple circulation. For the commodity as direct unit implies that the capitalist production process is also subject to a, quote, naturalization, end quote. Marx already emphasized this in the Grundrisse. As soon as the various elements of the reproduction process of capital, which are purchased as commodities, are joined together in the labor process, quote, all formal character is extinguished. It appears on the other side only as a simple production process, into which capital as such, as distinct from capital's substance, does not enter. It, bracket, appears, and bracket, only in the natural form of being, Daseinsform, of this substance, in which all relation to exchange value, to labor itself as the use value of capital, and hence all relation to capital itself, is extinguished, end quote. However, this appearance is illusion. This appearance is illusion because the circulating capital, which is fixed in the production process, is always already a unit of value and use value. Capital, therefore, appears to be nothing but a production instrument, and the production process of capital simply a labor process. As was discussed at the beginning, Adorno defends his idea of reducing society to a comprehensible coherence. It is both, quote, intelligible and unintelligible, end quote. Hermeneutics, however, must not merely be, quote, supplemented, end quote, by dialectics. Rather, what is unintelligible becomes the primary aspect that requires explanation, and hermeneutics the method of examining the meanings shared by individuals living in an inverted social order. Quote, a dialectical concept of meaning would not be a correlate of Weber's meaningful understanding, bracket, verstehen, end bracket, but rather the societal essence which shapes appearances, appears in them, and conceals them conceals itself in them, end quote. In the dialectical development of the categories, which understands the growth of irrational social relations as constituting and sustaining an independent, reversed world in which the bad infinity of value accumulation has become the primary driving force, simple circulation shows itself in the transfer of capital into production as, quote, surface, end quote, quote, the sphere of illusory appearance, end quote. The absolute separation between being and validity in Simmel's neo-Kantian conception of value presents itself against this background merely as a, quote, philosophical version, end quote, of the two-world economic doctrine. A world of, quote, validity and, quote, money arises above a world of goods in the so-called material capital as the, quote, real sphere, end quote. However, this view is only a conceptualization of what is experienced and observed by economic agents. Economic theory formulates and spells out these illusory appearances. However, because it does not know that the appearances are illusory, it attributes appearances to reality. Economics operates inherently as ideology. The first sensory supersensory world, the commodity as supersensory object, fixed capital as a special form of circulation, labor and labor's twofold character becomes reality in this two-world doctrine. Footnote. Bracket, the reference here is to Marx. Quote, the commodity form, reflects the social characteristics of men's own labor as objective characteristics of the products of labor themselves. as the socio-natural properties of these things, ... Hence, the commodity form reflects the social relation of producers to the sum total of labor as a social relation between objects ... Through this substitution ... the products of labor become commodities, sensuous things which are at the same time supersensible or social. End quote. Editor. End footnote. Well, the quotes from Marx, but the quotes, the footnotes provided by the editor. Anyway, end footnote. Where the hell am I? Above this, quote, reality, end quote, rises a sensory, supersensory world of functionally sublimated money forms, the character and ontological status of which cannot be clarified. However, as coin names and symbols, they can, or this is the assumption at least, only result from conscious positing. Footnote, let me finish the sentence actually. Conscious positing. Consequently, the workings of a capitalist economy are intelligible in overall terms. Footnote, the unreflected idea of reality obviously promotes the omnipotent fantasy of the economist and ultimately results in the, quote, tremendous, end quote, idea that money is created from nothing, a nothing that is at the same time, quote, barely grasped, end quote. Therefore, less than nothing? Question mark. In any case, a more or less, a quantity of money, ... However, what is a, quote, real quantity of money, end quote? What is it that makes this specific quantity a quantity? End footnote. Footnote. This concept of reality preforms the theories of value in economics. The pre-monetary value can only be conceptualized as use theory or as labor value doctrine in a kind of technological version. In both cases, and this is the only possibility in economics for the formulation of a theory of value, it is impossible to establish a connection between these, quote, values, end quote, and money. End footnote. Adorno's criticism of, quote, social nominalism, end quote, is therefore not only to be understood as a rejection of the simple construct of an exchange society. Adorno's criticism of, quote, social nominalism, end quote, aims are much wider. Adorno's criticism of, quote, social nominalism is a criticism of any sociological theory, no matter what the type, that wants to reduce society exclusively to intelligible actions. In the same way, methodological individualism, blind as methodological individualism is to categorical thinking, falls prey to the illusion that methodological individualism is able to deduce macroeconomics from rational actions. Thus, also hermeneutical sociology, the scope of which remains concealed from itself, wants to base its concept of society on intelligible actions. If, however, society is interpreted objectively as a functionally integrated system, such a theory likewise does not connect with social reality. Since system theories select their basic categories on the basis that these fit into, quote, a logical continuum in as uncontradictory a manner as possible, end quote, the systems theorist does not recognize that the, quote, highest structural concepts, end quote, are also determined by the facts, quote, subsumed under them, end quote. Adorno. Sociological theory literally makes no contact with the, quote, reality, end quote, of society, and society's, quote, real categories, end quote. That is, with society as subject, which is at the same time also an object. The concept of totality becomes accessible only in the context of value objectivity, which has become total. Otherwise, it must be conceived as a, quote, universal and meaningful whole, end quote. This unavoidably draws the theoretician into the hermeneutical circle. If totality is only an integrated set of meanings, then the theoretician himself, in the theoretician's act of recognition, also forms part of this whole and cannot escape from it. But why can Marx claim that he is able to understand and represent society? Because as a real unity, society is based on the dynamics of a, quote, objective conceptuality, end quote. The unity of society has a real existence in the unified character of abstract universal labor. This unity of society is grasped, but not explained, in the economy, in macroeconomic terms, as value amounts of the revenue flows to economic agents. The unity of society is presented theoretically as a system of overlapping circulations of capital. This is also expressed in the formation of categories. Whereas economics perceives fixed capital exclusively in its material form and makes capital absolute, in its two-world doctrine as a component of the real sphere, Marx always understands it as a special form of circulation. The concept of capital covers both worlds. The first so-called, quote, real, end quote, world is itself already a first supersensory world, above which the second supersensory world of the functionally sublimated money forms arises as a contrast. Rises as a contrast. Marx portrays the capitalist economy as a unity of the first and second supersensory worlds. Such an interconnection is indispensable if the capitalist system is to be correctly portrayed and meaningless babble avoided. It was in this sense that Marx understood his concept of capital as the reflected image of the reality of value. Quote, the exact development of the concept of capital is necessary since it is the fundamental concept of modern economics. Just as capital itself, whose abstract, reflected image is capital's concept, is the foundation of bourgeois society. The sharp formulation of the basic presuppositions of the relation must bring out all the contradictions of bourgeois production, as well as the boundary where it drives beyond itself. End quote. The process then consists in the fact that the concept of capital is confronted with the reality of the value movement in circulation, since this is only the change in form of value. It is therefore not confronted directly with so-called reality, but with a theoretical construct, reality in a theoretical form. As Marx states, quote, in a general analysis of this kind, it is usually always assumed that the actual conditions correspond to their conception, end quote. Only by such an approach can Marx find a method which makes it possible for him to develop economic categories which, long after his work ended, have not yet been theoretically explained by economic science, as is the case, for example, of the specific characteristic forms of capital which are analyzed in Marx's account of capital circulation in Volume 2 of Capital. Footnote. In his treatment of the transfer of capital, Marx noted that, quote, here as everywhere, it boils down to fixing the categories, end quote. I.e., sorry, did I say footnote? Sorry, I spaced out for a second. Footnote. In his treatment of the transfer of capital, Marx noted that, quote, here as everywhere it boils down to fixing the categories, end quote. Categories must first of all be established so that the value amount circulating as capital can be understood in its respective specific characteristic forms: circulation time, production time, transfer time. The history of the reception of the reproduction schema is beyond the scope of this article. Alfred Marshall was the first to pursue the idea of developing space and time as the modifying market-posited circumstances, as well as formulating a concept of capital which comprises both production and circulation, and therefore also space and time. Koleski used the reproduction schemata as a basis, which in turn found expression in Keynes' distinction between consumption and investment tendencies. See in this regard the comments of the editors in Arthur and Reuten's edited 1998 volume. My thanks to Fritz Fieler for this reference. End footnote. Marx is therefore, as paradoxical as this may sound, dealing with reality within the concept. Marx drags reality into the concept. Marx folds reality into the object, to use Adorno's expression, and in this way comprehends reality far more precisely than a science that has borrowed its ideal method from another science. Yeah, that's the end of the article. So thank you so much for listening. I'm looking at the footnotes, but they're all, the references, but they're all in German, except for Georg Simmel's Philosophy of Money. Thank you so much for listening.